Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're easing into a subject that is often spoken about in sharp voices, rushed terms and heavy labels, but deserves something calmer than that. We're going to spend time with the many ways the mind can struggle, bend, protect itself, misfire, adapt badly, and sometimes carry more than it was built to carry all at once. The topic is mental disorders, and although that phrase can sound clinical, distant, or even a little intimidating, the reality behind it is much more human. It is about thought, emotion, memory, fear, mood, identity, appetite, sleep, attention, and the fragile systems that quietly hold a life together. The mind, for all its brilliance, is not a machine with a tidy instruction booklet and a polite warning light that blinks before trouble starts. It is more like a house that has been added onto for millions of years. Some rooms are ancient and built for survival. Some are newer and better at language, planning, and pretending everything is fine in group settings. Some doors stick, some lights flicker, some alarms are a little too enthusiastic. Occasionally the smoke detector goes off because someone made toast. Occasionally it goes off because there really is fire. And sometimes a person can live for years inside that house before realizing that what they thought was simply their personality, their weakness, their flaw, or their fate may actually be a pattern with a name, a mechanism, and in many cases, a treatment. Before we go further, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time is it in your little corner of the world right now. There is something fitting about that, because mental life is deeply shaped by timing. The hour of the day changes how the mind feels. The age of a person changes what the mind can carry. Stress arrives on its own schedule. Memory keeps old calendars. Fear refuses to retire when it is no longer needed. Sadness can linger past its welcome. Energy can rise at the wrong moment. Sleep can vanish when the body begs for it. The mind is always keeping time, even when we wish it would stop checking the clock. If you find this soothing, useful, or simply a gentle way to wind down while learning something real, I would be very grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this calm little space reach other people who might want science explained without being shouted at. And now let us settle in and begin slowly, because this subject is broad, and it is easy to make it sound colder than it is. There is no need for that tonight. One of the strangest things about mental disorders is how close they sit to ordinary human experience. That is part of what makes them hard to understand. When we hear about a broken bone, the difference between the usual state and the injured one feels obvious. When we hear about infection, fever, or a damaged organ, there is at least a rough sense that something physical has gone wrong in a visible way. But mental disorders often emerge from systems everyone already uses every day. Everyone feels fear, everyone gets sad, everyone worries, everyone forgets things, loses focus, checks the door twice, eats for comfort now and then, feels socially awkward, has periods of low motivation, gets stressed, misread signals, and lies awake thinking about things that would have been better ignored until morning. The difference is not that a disorder introduces completely alien experiences into the human mind. The difference is often one of intensity, duration, rigidity, context, and consequence. Anxiety is normal. Terror that arrives without danger and keeps a person trapped is something else. Sadness is part of life. A mood that flattens pleasure, sleep, motivation, and hope for weeks or months at a time belongs to a different category. Paying attention to detail can be useful. Repeating rituals for hours because the mind insists catastrophe will strike, if they are not done just right, is not the same thing. High energy can feel productive and exciting, a state that drives sleeplessness, impulsive decisions, inflated confidence, racing speech, and eventually collapse is far more than just having a good week. This is one reason mental disorders are frequently misunderstood. They are built out of familiar pieces. A person looking from the outside may say, everyone gets anxious, everyone gets sad, everyone has trouble focusing, everyone feels shy, everyone overeats sometimes, everyone has mood swings, everyone worries about what others think. And that is true in the way that everyone has body temperature. But there is a large difference between being warm after walking upstairs and running a dangerous fever for days. The problem is not the existence of the feeling itself. The problem is what the feeling is doing, how strongly it arrives, how long it stays, how much it interferes, and whether it begins to take over the ordinary business of living. Mental disorders are not all the same kind of thing, and that matters too. Some are shaped strongly by genetics. Some are heavily influenced by trauma, chronic stress, early environment, loss, or instability. Some involve brain development unfolding differently from the start. Some are linked to patterns of thinking and coping that become rigid over time. Some sit close to changes in sleep, circadian rhythms, hormones, or substance use. Some are influenced by social context, isolation, poverty, discrimination, grief, chronic illness, or the simple long strain of being expected to function while quietly falling apart. None of this means a person is helpless, and none of it means the condition is imaginary. In fact, one of the most unfortunate habits in public conversation is the urge to sort suffering into two boxes, as if things are either biological and therefore real, or emotional and therefore somehow optional. The mind does not work that way. Experience changes the brain. The brain shapes experience. Thoughts affect body chemistry. Body chemistry affects thoughts. Stress alters sleep. Poor sleep worsens mood. Mood changes appetite. Appetite changes energy. Energy changes activity. Activity changes social contact. Social contact changes resilience. Resilience changes how stress is handled next time. Everything is talking to everything else, often at inconvenient hours and with very poor meeting management. Even the term mental disorder can confuse people, because it sounds as though the problem exists in some detached zone, far away from the rest of the body. But the brain is part of the body, and the mind is what the brain does in contact with the world. A disorder of mood may alter sleep, digestion, pain, movement, immune function, and concentration. A disorder of anxiety may tighten muscles, increase heart rate, upset the stomach, shorten the breath, and make the chest feel like it has been hired by panic to perform dramatic supporting roles. Trauma can change startle responses, vigilance, memory, and the sense of safety. Eating disorders can affect the heart, hormones, bones, temperature regulation, and cognition. Severe mental illness can influence not only thought and perception, but also life expectancy, relationships, finances, work, and the capacity to trust one's own mind from one day to the next. Another difficulty is that diagnosis is not as neat as many people imagine. Human beings do not arrive in clinic shaped like textbook examples, with all the correct labels attached and a summary card tucked politely into the sleeve. Symptoms overlap. Disorders travel together. Anxiety and depression often pair up like uninvited guests who arrived early and refused to leave. Trauma can look like anxiety, depression, irritability, numbness, sleeplessness, dissociation, or substance misuse. Attention problems may come from ADHD, anxiety, depression, sleep deprivation, burnout, grief, or simply trying to live in a world designed to interrupt every thought after 6 seconds. Some people internalize distress and go quiet. Others become agitated, impulsive, angry, or chaotic. Two people can carry the same diagnosis and look entirely different on the outside. This is part of why shame attaches so easily to mental suffering. The signs are often misread. A person with depression may be called lazy. A person with panic disorder may be called dramatic. A person with obsessive-compulsive disorder may be joked about as neat or picky, which is a bit like describing a hurricane as a windy inconvenience. A person with ADHD may hear that they just need discipline. A person with bipolar disorder may be reduced to a stereotype about moodiness. A person with schizophrenia may be feared rather than understood. A person with an eating disorder may be praised for control while the body is quietly being starved or purged into danger. From the outside, many disorders can resemble moral failure, personality defects, lack of willpower, or bad habits. That misunderstanding has injured a great many people. There is also the problem of language. People often use diagnostic words casually in everyday speech. Someone says, "I am so OCD about my desk," when they mean they like order. Someone says, "I am depressed today," when they mean disappointed or low. Someone says, "That scared me," and that is equated with panic. The language gets stretched thin. The result is that real disorders become harder to recognize, because the words for them have been flattened into slang. Liking symmetry is not the same thing as being trapped in rituals that consume hours and torment the mind. Feeling down for an afternoon is not the same as major depression. Being energetic and changeable is not the same as bipolar disorder. Enjoying a clean kitchen is probably just enjoying a clean kitchen, which is frankly one of the less controversial goals a person can have. At the same time, we should be careful not to swing too far the other way and turn every difficult emotion into pathology. Human life contains grief, heartbreak, fear, conflict, uncertainty, disappointment, loneliness, exhaustion, and periods of confusion. It would be a mistake to treat all pain as illness. Some suffering is a proportionate response to hard circumstances. Some anxiety is protective. Some sadness is love with nowhere to go. Some stress is the body preparing for demand. The challenge is knowing when a state has crossed from painful, but understandable, into persistent, impairing, and disordered. That threshold matters. It is part science, part judgment, part pattern recognition, and part listening carefully to how a person's life is actually functioning. In general, clinicians look for several things. They look for distress. They look for impairment. They look for duration. They look for whether symptoms are out of proportion to the situation. They look for whether the pattern is rigid rather than flexible. They look for whether the symptoms interfere with work, school, sleep, self-care, relationships, judgment, or physical health. They consider context, development, medical causes, substance use, trauma history, family patterns, and the person's own account of what is happening inside. This does not make diagnosis perfect, but it makes it more careful than simply pointing at behaviour and making grand pronouncements from the comfort of a sofa. What makes these conditions especially important to understand is that they do not simply affect thoughts in isolation. They change the shape of a life. A disorder can narrow the world. It can make a person stop travelling, stop eating properly, stop trusting others, stop trusting themselves, stop answering messages, stop sleeping, stop leaving the house, stop taking pleasure in what once mattered, or stop imagining a future that feels reachable. It can also distort time. Depression can make the day feel heavy and slow, while the months vanish in a blur of surviving. Anxiety can make a few minutes of uncertainty feel like an hour spent trapped in a small room with an alarm bell. Mania can make sleep seem optional and consequence negotiable. Trauma can make the past keep behaving like the present. Even attention disorders change time perception, with deadlines living in a strange universe where nothing exists. Then suddenly everything is due in 14 minutes. And yet, for all that seriousness, this is not a story only about damage. It is also a story about adaptation, treatment, and the stubborn flexibility of the nervous system. Many mental disorders are treatable. Some improve greatly with therapy. Some respond well to medication. Some need both. Some require changes in environment, routine, sleep, nutrition, social support, or substance use. Some need trauma-focused care. Some need structured skills and long-term work. Some benefit from learning that a pattern has a name, because naming it turns a shapeless private failure into something real that others have studied, survived, and helped before. There is often relief in that moment, Not always joy, certainly not instant repair, but relief. A person discovers they are not uniquely broken. Their mind is not inventing misery for entertainment. Their symptoms are recognizable. The loops they get stuck in have been mapped. Other people have lived inside similar weather. There are reasons, even when there is not a single simple cause. There are treatments, even when the road is not short. There are ways to manage, even when cure is not the right word. Understanding does not solve everything, but it changes the posture of the struggle. It replaces blind battle with orientation. That is what I would like this journey to do as we move forward. Not to reduce human experience to labels, and not to sensationalize suffering, but to make the landscape clearer. We are going to look at different groups of mental disorders and what they do. We will talk about fear when it will not switch off, sadness when it deepens into illness, energy when it runs too high or drops too low, thought patterns that become traps, stress that leaves marks long after danger passes, perception that loses contact with shared reality, eating and body image turning into harm, development that unfolds differently, and personality patterns that become enduring sources of difficulty and pain. Along the way, the aim will be simple: to understand what these conditions are, what they feel like, what they do to the body in daily life, and why they are not best understood as weakness dressed up in medical vocabulary. There is also something important to say about dignity. People with mental disorders are often explained in ways that erase them as people. They become examples, cases, headlines, cautionary tales, strange neighbours, or dramatic characters written for television by someone who has apparently never met a human being without background music. Real life is quieter and more complex than that. A person can have severe anxiety and still be kind, funny, competent, and exhausted. A person can live with psychosis and still have insight, tenderness, and a fierce wish for stability. A person with borderline personality disorder can feel emotions with painful intensity and also care deeply about others. A person with depression may look functional for months while carrying enormous weight in silence. A diagnosis describes a pattern of suffering and difficulty. It does not cancel personhood. It is also worth remembering that mental disorders are common, very common. Not identical in frequency, of course, and not equally severe, but common enough that nearly everyone has been touched by them directly or through someone they know. This fact can be both comforting and sobering. Comforting, because it means no one is especially strange for struggling. Sobering, because it reminds us how much invisible suffering can sit inside ordinary rooms, behind ordinary routines, hidden under polite conversation and decent lighting. The brain is an organ of prediction, regulation, memory, and survival. It is trying constantly to keep the organism alive. Sometimes the very systems built to protect us become miscalibrated. Fear generalizes. Alertness gets stuck on high. Reward circuits lose responsiveness. Habits harden. Threat detection becomes too eager. Self-evaluation becomes brutal. Energy regulation becomes unstable. Perception and interpretation drift. It is not always elegant. Evolution built a mind that is good enough to survive, not one guaranteed to remain serene while paying bills, processing grief, navigating relationships, sleeping under artificial light, carrying childhood wounds, consuming caffeine, reading headlines, ignoring exercise, and pretending everything is fine during meetings that could have been emails. So tonight, as we begin, the most useful starting point may be this. Mental disorders are not separate from ordinary humanity. They are exaggerated, persistent, dysregulated, or maladaptive versions of systems everyone has. They are the mind under strain, the brain in patterns that no longer serve well, the person caught in loops that produce distress and impairment instead of flexibility and balance. They are real. They are often painful. They are often misunderstood. They are not the whole of the person who has them. And because they are real, they can be studied. Because they can be studied, they can be explained. Because they can be explained, they can more often be recognized. And when they are recognized, they can be met with something better than shame, mockery, fear, or vague advice to simply think positive and go for a walk, though a walk can be lovely when properly assigned and not used as a replacement for psychiatry. So let us keep moving carefully. From here, it makes sense to begin with the broad question beneath all the labels, the one that sits underneath fear, mood, ritual, trauma, perception, and the many ways the mind can lose its balance. We need to look more closely at what mental disorders actually are, where they come from, and how a pattern becomes strong enough to begin shaping an entire life. When the mind hurts, it rarely announces itself with the clarity of a snapped bone or a feverish forehead. More often, it begins quietly, in ways that are easy to explain away. A person starts sleeping badly and blames stress. They stop enjoying things they usually like and call it a rough patch. They begin avoiding places that make them nervous and decide they are just tired, busy, or not in the mood. Thoughts become heavier, energy thinner, concentration more slippery. Days still move forward. Work still gets done, or mostly done. Messages still get answered, at least the important ones. From the outside, life may look intact. Inside, though, something has begun to shift. That is one reason mental disorders are often hard to recognize at first. They do not always arrive like intruders kicking down the front door. Quite often they move in like unwanted house guests, who start by taking up one chair, then one room, then gradually behave as though they have every right to reorganize the place. A person adapts around them. They make excuses. They lower expectations. They rearrange routines. They begin to think, perhaps this is just how I am now. And because the mind is the thing doing the noticing, judging, coping, and explaining all at once, it can be remarkably difficult to tell when normal strain has tipped into something more serious. So what is a mental disorder exactly? In the broader sense, it is a pattern of thoughts, emotions, behaviours, or perceptions that becomes persistent enough, intense enough, or disruptive enough to cause significant distress or impairment. That may sound clinical, but the core idea is simple. The systems that help a person think, feel, respond, and function are no longer working in a flexible, proportionate, and sustainable way. They may be running too high, too low, too fast, too rigidly, or in directions that make ordinary life harder rather than easier. That point about flexibility matters more than it may seem. Healthy minds are not happy all the time, calm all the time, or productive all the time. A healthy mind can be sad when something sad happens, anxious when there is real danger, distracted when tired, angry when treated badly, and withdrawn after loss. Normal mental life includes fluctuation. It includes rough periods. It includes grief, stress, embarrassment, heartbreak, self-doubt, and the occasional urge to hide under a blanket and ignore the existence of all email. Those things alone are not disorders. What begins to make something disordered is when the pattern sticks, spreads, or intensifies until it starts shaping the person's day, choices, health, relationships, and sense of self. Take fear as an example. Fear is useful. It keeps people from strolling into traffic with philosophical confidence. It sharpens attention when something truly matters. But if the alarm system becomes too sensitive, it stops serving the person and starts governing them. Suddenly the body reacts to supermarkets, conversations, public transport, or a racing heartbeat as though they are major threats. Avoidance grows. The world gets smaller. Life starts being organised around not triggering the system. That is no longer ordinary nervousness. It is a protective mechanism that has lost its sense of proportion. The same principle applies to mood. Everyone feels low at times. Motivation rises and falls. Some days feel flat. Some mornings feel like the brain has put its shoes on the wrong feet. But depression is not simply sadness with better publicity. It can flatten pleasure, distort thinking, disrupt sleep, change appetite, slow the body, cloud memory, reduce hope, and make the simplest tasks feel oddly distant and difficult. A shower becomes a project. Replying to a kind message feels impossible. The future stops looking like a place one is moving toward and starts feeling like an administrative burden. The mood is not just unpleasant, it begins to alter function. Mental disorders are often described using categories, but in real life they behave more like overlapping weather systems. Anxiety and depression frequently travel together. Trauma can look like anxiety, irritability, numbness, sleep problems, emotional shutdown, or constant alertness. Attention problems may come from ADHD, but they can also arise from exhaustion, chronic stress, depression, substance use, poor sleep, or grief. Obsessions may resemble ordinary worry until they become invasive, repetitive, and attached to compulsions that consume time and energy. Human minds do not line up neatly for labeling. They spill over categories, borrow each other's symptoms, and generally refuse to make life easy for textbooks. There is also no single cause behind mental disorders, which can be frustrating if one prefers tidy answers and simple villains. They are usually shaped by a mix of factors. Genetics matter, brain chemistry matters, temperament matters, early experiences matter, trauma matters, chronic stress matters, physical illness matters, sleep matters, isolation matters, hormones matter, drugs and alcohol matter, social conditions matter. None of these explains everything on its own, but together they help explain why one person develops panic attacks after a stressful year, while another develops depression after a loss, while another appears functional for a long time, and then suddenly cannot keep holding the weight together. A useful way to think about it is that the mind is always trying to regulate a very complicated organism in a very complicated world. It is managing threat detection, memory, social judgment, sleep, appetite, attention, motivation, energy, emotion, and behavior all at once. Under good conditions, it can do that well enough. Under strain, the system begins making trade-offs. It may become more vigilant at the cost of rest. It may shut down emotion at the cost of connection. It may seek control through rituals, restriction, or routines. It may chase relief through substances, avoidance, overwork, self-criticism, or impulsive behavior. These responses often begin as attempts to cope. The trouble is that coping strategies can become traps. That is one of the saddest and most important truths in this subject. Many symptoms start as adaptations. A child in an unpredictable home becomes hyper-alert, scanning moods and signals constantly. That skill may help them then, but later it looks like generalized anxiety, irritability, insomnia, or difficulty relaxing. Someone who has been hurt or humiliated becomes extremely careful, avoids risk, and tries to control every variable. For a while that may seem sensible. Over time it can become obsession, avoidance, or social withdrawal. A person who feels emotionally out of control may discover that food restriction, binging, self-harm, or substances create a brief sense of relief or numbness. The relief teaches the brain that the behavior works, at least for the moment. Soon the solution begins causing its own damage, but the brain is not always good at updating old lessons when short-term relief is involved. This is how mental disorders begin to shape a life, not usually in one dramatic scene, but in a series of adjustments. A person stops going to certain places, they stop trusting their memory, they need more time to do ordinary things, they become dependent on routines that feel protective, they avoid conversations, changes, mirrors, food, rest, closeness, conflict, or silence. Their world starts to narrow around the condition. Sometimes the person notices this clearly. Sometimes they simply call themselves difficult, lazy, weak, dramatic, broken, or bad at coping. The diagnosis, if it comes, often arrives long after the pattern has already rewritten daily life. Timing also matters. Some disorders begin early, and when they do, they can shape identity in deep ways. If a child grows up anxious, inattentive, depressed, or emotionally dysregulated, they may not think, I have symptoms. They may think, this is my personality. If they are punished or misunderstood, that belief hardens. The anxious child becomes the shy one who is always on edge. The inattentive one becomes the lazy or careless one. The depressed teenager becomes the dramatic or negative one. The child with obsessive thoughts becomes secretive and ashamed. The child who cannot regulate emotion becomes labelled difficult before anyone asks what their nervous system has learned to expect from the world. By adulthood, those labels can become part of the person's story about themselves. That story matters because it influences whether they seek help, whether they think they deserve help, and whether they imagine change is possible. A diagnosis can sometimes feel frightening, but it can also be relieving for exactly this reason. It offers an explanation that is more precise and less moralizing than the ones many people have been carrying for years. Instead of I am weak, there may be panic disorder. Instead of I ruin everything because I am unstable, there may be bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder or trauma. Instead of I am impossible and broken, there may be ADHD that was never recognized, depression that was never treated, or obsessive compulsive disorder hidden behind rituals no one understood. Of course, a label is only useful if it leads to understanding rather than reduction. A diagnosis should describe a pattern, not replace a person. Yet stigma often does exactly that. It turns a complex human being into a category and then treats the category like destiny. This is especially true with severe disorders, where fear and stereotypes distort public understanding. People hear a diagnosis and imagine violence, unpredictability, incompetence, or hopelessness. In reality, most people with mental disorders are far more likely to suffer quietly, withdraw, or be misunderstood than to become anything like the dramatic caricatures people carry in their heads. The effects on a life can be practical as much as emotional. Mental disorders interfere with sleep, and poor sleep worsens nearly everything. They interfere with concentration, which affects school, work, money, and confidence. They affect memory, which makes people doubt themselves. They affect relationships, not because people stop caring, but because it becomes harder to show up consistently, communicate clearly, or tolerate intimacy when the internal load is already heavy. Someone with anxiety may cancel plans repeatedly. Someone with depression may go silent. Someone with trauma may react strongly to things others barely notice. Someone with ADHD may forget, interrupt, lose track, overpromise, and underdeliver despite genuinely caring. Someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder may need hours of private rituals before leaving the house. Someone with psychosis may struggle to trust what others say is real. These are not abstract effects. They shape careers, friendships, marriages, parenting, health, and self-respect. And then there is shame, which is often the condition that attaches itself to all the others like a very rude accessory. Shame tells people they should be able to snap out of it, calm down, focus, try harder, be grateful, be normal, sleep earlier, think positive, meditate, journal, or simply stop making everything such a big deal. Some of those things can help in the right context. None of them works as a full explanation. Telling a person with severe depression to cheer up is roughly as useful as telling a person with a broken leg to believe in stairs. The advice may contain a hint of the desired direction, but it does very little to address the actual problem. Another reason disorders shape lives so strongly is that the brain learns through repetition. The more often a path is used, the easier it becomes to use again. If anxiety leads to avoidance, and avoidance brings short-term relief, the brain strengthens that loop. If low mood leads to withdrawal, and withdrawal reduces immediate demands, that loop strengthens too. If intrusive thoughts lead to checking or rituals and the checking temporarily eases dread, that pattern becomes more entrenched. Minds are efficient that way. They do not always distinguish between what helps now and what helps overall. They learn from what reduces distress in the moment Unfortunately, some of the most damaging patterns are very good at doing exactly that. This is why early intervention matters. The sooner a harmful loop is recognized, the easier it often is to interrupt. That does not mean late help is useless. Far from it. People improve after years of suffering all the time, but a disorder that has shaped routines, beliefs, relationships, and nervous system habits over many years usually requires more work to unwind than one caught earlier. A mind can heal, adapt, and learn throughout life, but it appreciates not being left alone with a faulty alarm system for a decade if alternatives are available. Treatment itself is not one thing. That is worth saying because people often ask whether mental disorders are real, enough to need medication, or psychological enough to need therapy, as though the brain has to choose one lane and stay there. In practice, treatment depends on the disorder, the severity, the person's history, and what maintains the problem. Therapy can help by changing thought patterns, behavior patterns, emotional regulation, trauma responses, relationships, and self-understanding. Medication can help by changing underlying chemistry in ways that make regulation more possible. Structure, sleep, exercise, reduced substance use, social support, and practical stability all matter too. Sometimes the right help is not glamorous. It is regular meals, safer housing, fewer night shifts, trauma-informed care, and one competent clinician who listens without acting surprised by human suffering. There is also the uncomfortable reality that many people do not get help early, or at all. Some do not recognize what is happening. Some fear judgment. Some cannot afford care. Some have learned to distrust systems. Some live in places where services are scarce. Some function just well enough to keep going and therefore look fine to everyone except themselves. This just well enough category includes a great many people. They are not in immediate crisis. They are also not okay. They are carrying symptoms in a way that drains years from the quality of their lives while appearing outwardly competent. Mental disorders do not have to destroy everything to matter. Quiet suffering still counts as suffering. An important thing to keep in mind is that disorders rarely affect only the person who has them. They shape families, partnerships, children, workplaces, and friendships. Loved ones adapt too. They may become protective, resentful, confused, frightened, exhausted, or overly accommodating. They may misunderstand symptoms as choices. They may try to fix what they cannot fix. Sometimes they help enormously. Sometimes, despite good intentions, they reinforce the pattern by protecting the person from every difficult feeling, or by dismissing the problem until it grows louder. Mental suffering is social in that way. It travels through rooms. It influences how people speak, plan, worry, withdraw, and hope. For all this, though, it is important not to turn mental disorders into totalizing stories. A person can have a disorder and also have preferences, humor, skills, loyalty, intelligence, creativity, and ordinary boring opinions about breakfast. Illness affects a life, but it does not become the whole person unless everyone around them insist on making it so. Good care respects both truths at once. The condition is real and serious. The person is more than the condition. That sounds obvious, but human beings are remarkably talented at forgetting obvious things once labels enter the room wearing official shoes. As conditions develop, they also influence how people see the future. This may be one of the cruelest effects. The anxious mind predicts danger. The depressed mind predicts failure and emptiness. The traumatized mind predicts repetition. The obsessive mind predicts catastrophe unless rituals are obeyed. The manic mind predicts possibility without proportion. The psychotic mind may predict threat from within the very structure of reality as it appears. In each case, the future gets distorted. That distortion then influences present choices, which strengthens the disorder's hold. A life becomes shaped not only by symptoms but by expectations. Still, human minds are not static. They can become trapped, but they can also relearn. A A person can discover that panic peaks and passes. They can learn that thoughts are not commands. They can understand that moods shift, that attention can be supported, that trauma responses make sense even when they no longer serve, that rituals can be resisted, that shame can be questioned, that medication can help, that rest is not laziness, that needing treatment is not failure. This relearning is rarely dramatic. It is often repetitive, unglamorous, and slow. It may involve setbacks, side effects, awkward therapy sessions, notebooks full of patterns, gradual exposure to feared situations, apologies, boundary setting, medication adjustments, and the deeply thrilling act of remembering to eat lunch before 4 in the afternoon. Recovery, in other words, tends to look more like practice than magic. So when we ask what mental disorders are and how they begin to shape a life, the answer is not simply that something is wrong in the brain. It is that patterns of distress, regulation, perception, and behaviour become strong enough to organise daily existence around themselves. They influence sleep, work, movement, appetite, memory, relationships, identity, and expectation. They begin as experiences, become habits, reshape beliefs, and then start writing rules for the person's life. That is why understanding them matters, not to put everyone in boxes, but to recognise when a pattern is no longer just a difficult season and has become something with real momentum. From here, it helps to turn toward one of the most common ways that momentum begins, because for many people, the first sign that the mind is starting to hurt is not sadness or confusion, but fear that stops behaving like fear should. It starts showing up too often, too loudly, and in places where safety should have been ordinary. That is where anxiety disorders begin to enter the picture, and once they do, they have a very particular way of teaching the body to be afraid of its own alarms. When fear begins doing more than protecting a person from actual danger, it can take on a life of its own. That is the difficult starting point for anxiety disorders. Fear, in its proper place, is useful. It sharpens attention, speeds reaction, tightens the muscles, and tells the body to prepare for something important. A nervous system without fear would be a terrible survival tool. People would step into reckless situations, miss warning signs, trust what should not be trusted, and generally behave like they had been handed a body with all the alarms politely removed for convenience. Fear exists for good reason. The problem begins when the alarm system starts firing too often, too loudly, or in places where the danger is imagined, exaggerated, misread, or no longer present. That is what makes anxiety disorders so exhausting. The system involved is not foreign to human life. It is not some strange new machine installed overnight. It is the ordinary threat detection system, but miscalibrated. It becomes too sensitive, too persistent, too ready to interpret uncertainty as risk and discomfort as catastrophe. A person may know, at least intellectually, that they are not in mortal danger in the grocery store, on the train, at a party, during a meeting, or while lying in bed at 2:17 in the morning remembering an awkward thing they said 4 years ago. The body may not care. The body may still flood with adrenaline, tighten the chest, shorten the breath, upset the stomach, and prepare for disaster like an employee who took the emergency manual far too seriously and has never emotionally recovered. Anxiety disorders come in several forms, but they share a family resemblance. They involve fear, anticipation, tension, avoidance, and a nervous system that struggles to settle. The person is not simply worried in the casual everyday sense. They are often trapped in cycles of alarm that affect sleep, concentration, work, appetite, digestion, relationships, and movement through the world. Their body becomes a place where tension lives. Their thoughts become crowded with what-ifs. Their choices begin orbiting around the need to prevent distress, escape distress, or explain distress. And slowly, sometimes so slowly that no one notices at first, their life gets organised around fear. To understand this properly, it helps to separate a few things that often get blurred together. Fear is the immediate response to a perceived threat. Anxiety is more about anticipation. Fear says, something is happening now. Anxiety says something bad could happen soon, and perhaps I should start suffering in advance just to be thorough. Worry is the mental version of that process, a repetitive attempt to think through possible problems, prevent danger, and gain certainty. Panic is the body's acute alarm response, often intense and sudden. These processes overlap, but they are not identical. In anxiety disorders, they tend to reinforce each other. The mind predicts danger, the body reacts, the body's reaction feels alarming, and the mind takes that as proof that danger must be real. Round and round it goes. The biology behind this is not mysterious, even if the experience can feel very strange from the inside. When the brain detects threat, or thinks it does, it activates systems designed for survival. The amygdala, a small structure deeply involved in emotional learning and threat detection, helps flag danger. The sympathetic nervous system increases arousal, heart rate rises, breathing becomes faster and shallower, muscles tense, blood flow shifts, digestion slows or becomes erratic. The body gets ready to fight, flee, or in some cases freeze. Hormones like adrenaline and cortisol help sustain the response. In short bursts, this is useful. In chronic anxiety, it becomes draining. It is like revving a car engine every few minutes while insisting you're not going anywhere, which is not especially good for the engine or the person sitting inside it. One of the most common forms is generalized anxiety disorder. This is not just being a worrier or a careful person. It is a persistent state of excessive worry that is difficult to control and spreads across multiple parts of life: health, money, work, family, future plans, everyday responsibilities, possible mistakes, unlikely disasters, vague unease, small symptoms, big decisions, whether the stove is off, whether the message sounded rude, whether someone is upset, whether something is being forgotten, whether something bad is coming. The mind keeps moving from one concern to the next as though it believes constant vigilance might somehow bribe the future into behaving. What makes generalized anxiety especially tiring is that it is often accompanied by physical tension that never quite leaves. The shoulders stay tight, the jaw clenches, sleep becomes shallow or delayed, concentration fragments. The person feels keyed up, restless, irritable, or unable to switch off. Even pleasant moments can be invaded by worry, because the anxious mind has a habit of treating calm as suspicious. It thinks, if I relax, I might miss something important. So it keeps scanning, it keeps preparing, it keeps rehearsing possible trouble. The person may seem high-functioning from the outside because they are still working, planning, checking, remembering, and appearing responsible. Inside, though, the cost is high. It is very hard to rest when the mind treats rest like negligence. Then there is panic disorder, which introduces one of the crueler loops in anxiety. Panic attacks can be terrifying. The heart pounds, the chest tightens, breathing changes. There may be dizziness, shaking, sweating, nausea, numbness, tingling, a feeling of unreality, or a powerful sense that something awful is about to happen. Many people having a panic attack for the first time think they are dying, losing control, or losing their mind. From their point of view, this is not dramatic. It feels physically enormous. The body is making a very convincing case that emergency measures are appropriate. A panic attack is essentially a false alarm, but that phrase can sound dismissive unless handled carefully. False does not mean mild. It does not mean imagined in the childish sense. It means the alarm system has activated without the kind of external threat it was built for. The body responds as though survival is at stake, and the person must endure that wave of sensation while trying not to be persuaded by it. In panic disorder, The problem becomes not only the attacks themselves, but the fear of having another one. This leads to anticipatory anxiety. The person starts scanning their body for early signs. They become afraid of places where escape might feel difficult. They avoid exertion, heat, caffeine, crowds, long lines, driving, public transport, elevators, meetings, or being alone. Soon, the fear is not just of panic, it is of the conditions under which panic might occur. This is where agoraphobia can begin to take shape. Popular culture often reduces agoraphobia to fear of leaving the house, but it is more accurate to say it is fear of being in situations where escape feels difficult, help feels unavailable, or panic symptoms would be especially hard to manage. A person might fear buses, shopping centres, theatres, open spaces, enclosed spaces, standing in line, or being outside alone. The world becomes mapped not by interest or necessity, but by how trapped a person might feel if their body turns against them. The safe zone shrinks. Routines become rigid. Some people become housebound. Others still go out, but only with elaborate precautions, companions, exit plans, water bottles, medication in the pocket, route rehearsals, and constant internal negotiation. Social anxiety disorder is another major form, and it is often misunderstood as simple shyness. Shyness is common and usually softens with familiarity. Social anxiety involves intense fear of being judged, embarrassed, rejected, scrutinized, or exposed in a way that feels unbearable. The person may dread speaking, eating, writing, performing, asking questions, attending gatherings, making calls, or even walking into a room where other people might notice them. Their mind does not merely say, "I hope this goes okay." It says, "They will see everything wrong with me. They will notice my voice, my hands, my face, my silence, my mistake, my awkwardness, my very existence." It is an exhausting level of self-monitoring. The body joins in, of course. Blushing, sweating, trembling, dry mouth, shaky voice, stomach distress, racing heart, mental blankness. Then the person becomes anxious about showing signs of anxiety, which creates the kind of elegant feedback loop only the nervous system could devise. They think, "Do not blush," which is an excellent way to become aware of the face. They think, "Do not shake," which invites immediate attention to the hands. They think, "Say something normal." The brain, now under inspection, responds by misplacing language like a stressed office worker who cannot find the file while everyone watches. Specific phobias are narrower, but can still have a strong effect on life. Heights, flying, needles, blood, certain animals, storms, vomiting, enclosed spaces, and many other things can become objects of intense fear. People often know the reaction is disproportionate, which does not prevent the reaction from happening. A person can understand perfectly well that the elevator is not a death chamber and still feel their body insist otherwise. Phobias may sound almost manageable when listed briefly, but avoidance can become surprisingly influential. It can affect travel, medical care, career choices, housing, relationships, and everyday freedom. A needle phobia, for example, can interfere with important treatment. A fear of flying can narrow a person's world. A fear of vomiting can influence how and where they eat, travel, socialize, or care for children. Separation anxiety is often associated with childhood, but it can affect adults too. It involves intense distress related to being away from attachment figures or home, with fears about harm, abandonment, accidents, illness, or loss. Children may refuse school, complain of physical symptoms, or panic at parting. Adults may become highly distressed by travel, distance, or lack of contact, and may structure their lives to avoid separation. Again, the pattern is not just affection or closeness. It is fear that becomes disabling. Across all these disorders, avoidance plays a central role. Avoidance is deeply understandable. It works, briefly. If a situation triggers anxiety and the person leaves, the anxiety drops. The brain learns leaving saved us. If a ritual reduces the tension, the brain learns repeat that next time. If reassurance helps for a moment, the brain learns ask again. If staying home prevents panic today, the brain learns home is safer. The relief is real, and that is exactly why the pattern strengthens. The trouble is that avoidance teaches the brain that the feared thing really was dangerous. It prevents new learning. The person never gets the chance to discover fully and repeatedly that the anxiety could rise and fall without catastrophe. So the fear stays alive. That is one reason anxiety disorders often become larger over time if untreated. Avoidance spreads. A person starts by avoiding one road, one store, one type of social situation, one bodily sensation, one uncertainty. Then the circle widens. The mind begins generalizing, which is what anxious minds do best. If panic happened once on a train, trains become risky. Then stations become risky. Then crowds. Then being far from home. If embarrassment happened in one meeting, meetings become risky. Then speaking. Then introducing oneself. Then attending at all. Anxiety is rarely content to stay politely in one corner. Given enough reinforcement, it expands like ivy with a strategic plan. The effects on the body are easy to underestimate if one thinks of anxiety as purely mental. In reality, chronic anxiety can feel like living in a body that never fully unclenches. Muscles stay tight. Headaches become common. Digestion becomes unpredictable. Some people lose appetite. Others eat for comfort. Sleep becomes difficult, not always because the person is consciously worrying, but because the body remains too alert to settle deeply. Heart palpitations and chest discomfort may send people to medical care repeatedly, convinced something terrible is being missed. Sometimes they are reassured, feel relief for 6 minutes, and then the next sensation restarts the entire process. Anxiety can also make people more aware of ordinary bodily changes. A skipped heartbeat, a dizzy moment, a flutter in the stomach, a warm face, a slight shortness of breath. Most bodies do these things from time to time. The anxious mind treats them like coded warnings from a very dramatic messenger. Cognition changes too. Concentration becomes harder because attention is pulled toward threat, either external or internal. Working memory suffers when too much mental space is occupied by scanning, predicting, rehearsing, and managing fear. The anxious person may appear distracted, indecisive, forgetful, or irritable. Decisions become harder because each option is evaluated not just for its practical value, but for all the ways it could go wrong. Certainty becomes the gold standard, which is unfortunate because life is built almost entirely out of uncertainty. This mismatch creates enormous strain. The anxious mind wants guarantees from a world that does not provide them. There is also the emotional toll of feeling unable to relax. This part is sometimes less visible than panic or overt worry, but it matters a great deal. Many people with chronic anxiety do not remember what true mental rest feels like. Even calm moments are monitored. Even weekends are mentally preloaded with unfinished tasks, future concerns, or vague dread. Pleasure becomes thinner because part of the mind remains on duty. Relationships may suffer because the person seeks constant reassurance, becomes irritable from exhaustion, or avoids situations others enjoy. They may look high-strung, controlling, or withdrawn when in fact they are trying very hard to keep themselves from tipping into overwhelm. It is worth noting that anxiety can be shaped by temperament and learning very early. Some children are more behaviourally inhibited from the start. They react strongly to novelty, need more time to warm up, and may be more sensitive to threat cues. That does not doom anyone to an anxiety disorder, but it can create vulnerability, especially in stressful or unpredictable environments. If a child grows up around danger, conflict, criticism, instability or anxiety modelled by caregivers, the nervous system may learn that hypervigilance is simply how one stays safe. Later, even in less dangerous settings, the body continues using the same rules. The old learning does not retire just because the address changed. Modern life is not especially kind to anxious minds either. Constant stimulation, uncertain economies, social comparison, disrupted sleep, high caffeine use, reduced physical recovery, endless digital input, and a culture that rewards vigilance can all keep the system running hot. None of these creates an anxiety disorder by itself, but they can certainly add fuel to a nervous system already inclined to over-prepare for disaster. Anxious people are often conscientious, observant, and responsible. Unfortunately, those strengths can be recruited into the service of worry. The person becomes extremely good at imagining problems, planning contingencies, and noticing subtle signs that something might be off. Their mind is working hard. It is simply pointed in a direction that costs too much. The good news, and it is genuinely good, is that anxiety disorders are highly treatable. Not always quickly, not always comfortably, and not always with one neat solution, but treatable. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the best studied approaches. It helps people identify distorted patterns of thinking, understand the mechanics of anxiety, and change the behaviors that keep it going. Exposure-based work is especially important. This means gradually and repeatedly facing feared situations, sensations, or thoughts without escaping or relying on safety behaviors to make them tolerable. The goal is not to prove that nothing ever feels scary. The goal is to teach the brain that fear can be endured, that sensations are not always dangerous, and that catastrophe does not follow simply because anxiety showed up wearing its usual costume. Medication can help too, particularly when symptoms are severe, persistent, or broad. Certain antidepressants, especially SSRIs and SNRIs, are commonly used because they can reduce the intensity of the anxiety system over time. Some people benefit greatly, some need adjustments, some experience side effects that make the process a little less elegant than one would hope. Short-term medications may sometimes be used, though they must be handled carefully because quick relief can come with dependence or rebound problems. Therapy and medication often work well together, especially when anxiety has become deeply woven into behavior and body response. Practical habits matter as well, though they are usually supports rather than cures on their own. Regular sleep, less caffeine, physical activity, breathing practices, structured routines, and reducing substance use can all lower the general load on the nervous system. So can learning not to treat every anxious thought as a problem to solve. That sounds simple and is annoyingly difficult. Anxious minds love problem solving. They believe their value lies in preventing every possible bad outcome. One of the great tasks of recovery is learning that uncertainty can be tolerated and that not every thought deserves a committee meeting. Perhaps the hardest part is this. Improvement often requires moving toward the very things the anxious system wants to avoid. The person has to feel some fear on purpose. They have to stay in the conversation, enter the store, ride the elevator, leave the house, allow the racing heart, stop asking for reassurance, resist the checking, speak while blushing, travel while uncomfortable, and learn that anxiety rises and falls like other body states. The system learns through experience, not through perfect logic alone. Fear will always produce arguments. Recovery often begins when a person stops negotiating with every alarm and starts teaching the body a new pattern. That does not mean anxiety disappears forever, or that calm becomes permanent. It means the relationship changes. The person becomes less afraid of fear itself. Their life stops shrinking around it. They get back space, movement, spontaneity, and trust in their own ability to cope. And that matters, because anxiety disorders are not only about fear, they're about freedom. They quietly determine where a person goes, what they attempt, whom they call, how deeply they sleep, how fully they rest, and how far their life can extend beyond the walls built by anticipation. Yet anxiety is only one form of suffering the mind can produce. For some people, the main problem is not constant alarm, but a deep slowing, a loss of pleasure, or a dangerous swing between emotional states that change energy, judgment, and hope itself. When that happens, the weather inside the mind begins shifting in a different way, and that brings us to mood disorders. Anxiety fills the mind with alarms, but mood disorders alter something even broader. They change the emotional climate a person lives inside. Instead of fear standing in the doorway saying something might go wrong, mood disorders can make the whole day feel heavy, flat, driven, sped up, or strangely unstable. The person is still living in the same house, talking to the same people, doing the same job, walking through the same rooms, but the inner weather has shifted. Light does not land the same way. Effort costs more, or sometimes far less than it should. Sleep changes, appetite changes, thinking changes, hope changes. And because mood affects almost every part of being alive, these disorders can quietly reshape a life from the inside out. Depression and bipolar disorder are two of the main examples. They are not ordinary sadness or ordinary moodiness made to sound more official. They are clinical patterns that affect emotion, energy, behavior, sleep, judgment, concentration, and the ability to function in daily life. Depression is often misunderstood because everyone knows what sadness feels like. That familiarity makes people assume they understand the illness, when often they are only recognizing one small piece of it. Ordinary sadness usually has a shape. Something happened, the emotion rises, and eventually it moves. Depression is different. NIMH describes it as a condition that can cause severe symptoms affecting how a person feels, thinks, and handles daily activities like sleeping, eating, and working. And diagnosis generally requires symptoms most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 weeks. Common features include low mood, loss of interest or pleasure, fatigue, hopelessness, guilt, slowed thinking, trouble concentrating, sleep changes, appetite changes, physical aches without a clear cause, and thoughts of death or suicide. Some people look tearful and slowed down. Others look irritable, numb, detached, restless, or oddly flat, as if the mind has stopped producing colour but is still trying to pass as operational. One of the cruelest features of depression is that it attacks motivation and then blames the person for lacking it. Simple acts become difficult in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never felt it. Taking a shower can seem as complicated as filing tax returns in a moving vehicle. Answering a message feels like lifting furniture with the mind. Pleasure drops away, so the usual rewards that help move a person through the day stop doing their job. The depressed brain may not respond normally to rest, praise, good news, or even love. This is why depression is so often mistaken for laziness or indifference. From the outside, the person seems to be doing less. From the inside, they may be using nearly all their energy just to appear barely normal. Depression can also bring physical symptoms, including headaches, digestive problems, sleep disruption, and a feeling of heaviness or slowing that settles into the body as much as the mind. Depression does not always look the same in everyone, which is part of why it can go unrecognized. NIMH notes that children may look anxious, cranky, or clingy. Teenagers may become irritable, restless, or withdrawn, and adults may present with sadness, low energy, sleep changes, or a bleak view of the future. Men are also more likely to show anger, irritability, physical complaints, or increased substance use rather than openly describing sadness. Some people oversleep, others cannot sleep. Some lose appetite, others eat more. Some cry often, others feel almost nothing except exhaustion and self-criticism. There is major depression, where symptoms are more intense and interfere with daily functioning for at least 2 weeks, and persistent depressive disorder, in which symptoms may be less dramatic but last much longer, often 2 years or more. There are also seasonal forms, depression connected to pregnancy or the postpartum period, and severe cases that can include psychosis. In other words, depression is not one neat costume. It is a family of low and distorted states that share certain core features while wearing different faces. Where depression comes from is rarely one simple cause. The World Health Organization describes it as arising from a complex interaction of social, psychological and biological factors, and NIMH similarly points to genetic, biological, environmental and psychological contributors. Adverse life events such as bereavement, trauma, unemployment, chronic stress, illness, or ongoing social strain can increase risk. But depression can also appear in people whose life looks reasonably intact from the outside. That is one reason it can be so confusing. People think, nothing terrible has happened, so why do I feel like this? The answer is that mood disorders are not moral verdicts handed down only after dramatic suffering. They are conditions shaped by vulnerability, stress, physiology, and circumstance in combinations that differ from person to person. Depression can also coexist with chronic pain, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and other mental disorders, and each side can worsen the other. The mind and body are not holding separate meetings. They are in the same building, passing problems between departments. Bipolar disorder sits in the mood disorder family too, but it behaves differently. It involves episodes of depression, along with periods of unusually elevated or irritable mood and increased activity, which can take the form of mania, or the less severe hypomania. NIMH describes bipolar disorder as chronic or episodic, marked by extreme mood changes that are more severe than ordinary ups and downs, and that can interfere with work, relationships, and daily functioning. The NHS likewise notes that the main symptom is extreme changes in mood, with high periods and low periods often lasting days or weeks, separated at times by stretches of relative stability. This is important because many people hear bipolar and imagine quick mood swings from one hour to the next. That can happen in ordinary speech, but clinically the condition is about episodes that have a pattern, duration, and change in functioning, not simply being emotionally changeable on a stressful Tuesday. Mania is not just feeling good, productive, or energetic. It is a state in which mood, drive, confidence, activity, and judgment rise beyond the person's usual level in ways that can become risky or impairing. People may sleep very little without feeling tired, speak rapidly, jump from idea to idea, become unusually irritable or euphoric, feel exceptionally important or powerful, and take more risks with sex, money, substances, driving, or impulsive plans. NIMH notes that manic symptoms can become so severe that hospital care is needed in bipolar I disorder, and that severe manic or depressive episodes may also include psychotic symptoms such as delusions or hallucinations that match the person's mood state. Hypomania is milder and may even feel appealing at first. A person may seem productive, charming, creative, funny, and unusually alive. That is part of the trap. Because it can feel good, the person may not recognize it as illness, while people around them notice that something is off. In time, the cost often appears in broken sleep, impulsive decisions, financial damage, conflict, exhaustion, or the depressive drop that can follow. The depressive side of bipolar disorder can look very similar to ordinary major depression, which is one reason diagnosis is sometimes missed for years. NIMH notes that some people with bipolar II disorder seek help only when they are depressed, while hypomanic periods may go unnoticed or be misread as periods of being unusually efficient, sociable, or driven. This matters because treatment choices differ. Bipolar I is defined by manic episodes, often with depressive episodes as well. Bipolar II involves depressive episodes plus hypomanic episodes without full mania. Cyclothymia involves recurring hypomanic and depressive symptoms that are not intense or long enough to qualify as full episodes. There can also be mixed episodes, where manic and depressive symptoms appear together. That combination can be especially miserable because it blends activation with despair. Imagine having the engine of agitation and the despair of depression running at the same time. It is one of the uglier tricks mood can play. Mood disorders change more than feeling. They change time, identity, and decision-making. Depression narrows the future. The person stops imagining that things will improve, not because they have carefully reviewed the evidence like a tiny legal expert, but because the illness alters expectation itself. Food loses pleasure. Friends feel far away. Tasks look enormous. Memory and concentration worsen. Self-criticism grows louder. Bipolar disorder can distort in the other direction during high states. The future appears full of possibility, but judgment becomes less reliable. Risk seems smaller. Sleep feels optional. Plans multiply faster than consequences can catch up. In both directions, the person can drift away from their own baseline and then suffer the practical fallout. Jobs can be lost, relationships strained, money mishandled, school interrupted, family life destabilized. NIMH notes that bipolar disorder can be a factor in suicide, job loss, family discord, and reduced ability to function, while severe depression can also impair major life activities and is associated with suicidal thinking or behavior in some people. Another reason these disorders shape lives so deeply is that they influence the stories people tell about themselves. The depressed person may conclude that they are weak, boring, broken, or fundamentally incapable. The person with bipolar disorder may look back on manic or hypomanic episodes with confusion, shame, or grief over what was said, spent, promised, or damaged. Loved ones may misunderstand too. Depression can be read as withdrawal, ingratitude, or laziness. Mania can be read as confidence, charisma, brilliance, or simply finally doing better, right before things start catching fire, in the figurative sense and occasionally in the financial one. Because mood disorders can alter insight, especially in elevated states, family and friends sometimes recognize trouble before the person does. That can create conflict. No one enjoys being told, very gently or otherwise, that their grand plan to move cities, launch 3 businesses, sleep 2 hours a night, and explain the universe to everyone at dinner may not be entirely sound. The good news is that treatment works for many people. WHO states that effective treatments for depression include psychological treatments and medications, with psychological treatment often used first, and antidepressants added especially in moderate to severe cases. NIMH similarly notes that depression is commonly treated with psychotherapy, medication, or both, with brain stimulation therapies such as ECT or RTMS used in some resistant or life-threatening cases. For bipolar disorder, NIMH recommends treatment with medication, psychotherapy, or a combination. Common medications include mood stabilizers such as lithium or valproate and atypical antipsychotics, while psychotherapy can provide skills, support, and strategies. NIMH also notes that lithium can reduce suicide risk, and that antidepressants in bipolar disorder are generally not used alone because they can trigger mania or rapid cycling. This is one reason accurate diagnosis matters so much. The goal is not just to treat low mood, but to understand the full pattern of the illness over time. Daily rhythms matter more than many people expect, especially in bipolar disorder. NIMH highlights interpersonal and social rhythm therapy as one evidence-based approach, because sleep and routine are not small details in mood illness. Irregular sleep, missed nights, disrupted schedules, substance use, and prolonged stress can all destabilize vulnerable systems. That does not mean routine cures bipolar disorder or depression by itself, but it does mean mood is tied closely to biology. The brain keeps time, and mood disorders often disturb that timing. A steady sleep schedule, reduced alcohol or drug use, adherence to treatment, and noticing early warning signs can make a real difference. Likewise with depression, activity, social contact, regular meals, movement, and structure can support recovery even when they do not feel appealing at first. This is not because the illness is simple, it is because the body and mind are always talking, and sometimes they need help remembering the rhythm. perhaps the most important thing to remember is that mood disorders are not personality verdicts. They are not proof that a person is weak, dramatic, selfish, or impossible to love. They are illnesses that alter mood, energy, thought, and behaviour in ways that can be severe but are also understandable and treatable. NMH advises seeking professional help when distressing symptoms last 2 weeks or more, especially when they affect sleep, appetite, concentration, interest, or the ability to do usual tasks. That matters because people often wait far too long, hoping the weather inside will correct itself if they simply endure it with enough silence. Sometimes it does pass, often it does not, and when it does not, treatment is not surrender, it is orientation. It is the moment a person stops treating a storm like a personal failing and starts recognizing it as something that can be mapped, monitored, and managed. From there, though, mood is not the only place the mind can get stuck. Sometimes the suffering comes not from low or high states, but from thoughts that repeat, doubts that will not settle, and urges that demand ritual after ritual in exchange for brief relief. That is where the mind begins tightening into a different kind of pattern, and it leads us toward obsessive-compulsive and related disorders. Some forms of suffering arrive like a storm loud enough that everyone notices. Others arrive like a loop. A thought appears, then returns. A doubt comes in, then comes back with friends. An urge rises, is resisted for a moment, then presses again until it feels less like a thought and more like a demand. The person checks, washes, repeats, counts, arranges, pulls, picks, hides, reassures themselves, then feels relief for a few minutes before the tension begins rebuilding all over again. This is the difficult territory of obsessive-compulsive and related disorders, where the mind can become trapped in repetition, and the body can be recruited into rituals that promise safety, certainty, or relief, but never hold those things for long. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, is marked by recurring uncontrollable obsessions, compulsions, or both, and symptoms often begin between late childhood and young adulthood. It helps to begin with the distinction, because these disorders are widely misunderstood. OCD is not simply liking things neat, enjoying routine, or preferring symmetry. Those traits may be ordinary preferences. OCD involves obsessions, which are intrusive, unwanted thoughts, urges, or images that create distress, and compulsions, which are repetitive behaviours or mental acts a person feels driven to do in response. The obsessions may involve contamination, harm, religion, sex, order, morality, health, relationships, or the fear that something terrible will happen unless the correct action is taken. The compulsions may involve washing, checking, counting, repeating, arranging, confessing, mentally reviewing, praying, seeking reassurance, or other rituals meant to reduce anxiety or prevent a feared event. The person often knows the behaviour is excessive or irrational, which does not make it easier to stop. That is part of what makes OCD so painful. The mind is producing fear, the person recognises the distortion, and still the urge remains stubbornly in place, asking for one more check, one more rinse, one more certainty that never quite arrives. The emotional logic of OCD is strangely persuasive. It does not usually say, do this because it is pleasant. It says, do this because if you do not, you are reckless, careless, immoral, dangerous, dirty, irresponsible, or somehow inviting catastrophe. A person may know that touching a doorknob is not likely to kill anyone, yet the mind produces an image of contamination, and the body responds with disgust and alarm. Another person may know perfectly well that they do not want to harm a child, a partner, or a stranger, yet a violent, intrusive thought appears, and the very fact that it appeared feels horrifying. That horror is often misread by the sufferer as evidence that the thought means something important. In reality, intrusive thoughts are common across the population. What often separates OCD is not the existence of strange or disturbing thoughts, but the meaning attached to them and the ritualized response that follows. The thought is treated like a threat. The threat creates anxiety. The anxiety demands action, and the action briefly relieves it. Then the loop strengthens. This loop is one of the central mechanics of the disorder. The compulsion works, but only in the short term. That is exactly the problem. If checking the door reduces dread, the brain learns that checking matters. If washing lowers disgust, the brain learns that washing prevented danger. If mentally reviewing a conversation relieves guilt, the brain learns that reviewing is protective. Each ritual becomes a lesson in fear. The person is not just performing an odd habit. They are teaching the nervous system that the obsession was important and that relief depends on ritual. Soon the rituals may spread. Hand washing becomes showering in elaborate sequences. Checking becomes photographing the stove, then checking the photograph, then distrusting the photograph. Mental rituals become endless silent loops, invisible from the outside but exhausting on the inside. The disorder can consume hours a day and may significantly interfere with work, school, relationships, and ordinary routines. There is also a quieter cruelty in OCD, which is shame. Many obsessions are not about germs or order, the stereotypes people tend to recognize. They may involve blasphemous thoughts in a religious person, sexual thoughts the person finds horrifying, fears of hurting someone they love, or fears that they have already caused harm without realizing it. Because the content feels so disturbing, people often hide it for years. They fear that disclosing the thought will make others believe they want it, endorse it, or secretly are what they fear. In reality, OCD often attacks what the person values most. A loving parent may become obsessed with accidental harm to their child. A moral person may become consumed by doubt about sin, honesty, or responsibility. A careful driver may circle back repeatedly to check whether they hit someone. The mind seems to go directly for the person's deepest sense of danger, guilt, and responsibility, then repeats the attack until daily life narrows around it. Not all compulsions are visible, and that can make the disorder even harder to spot. Some people perform mostly mental rituals. They silently count, repeat phrases, review memories, pray in a precise way, or try to cancel one thought with another. From the outside, they may look merely distracted or tense. Inside, they are doing exhausting invisible labor. Others seek reassurance constantly. They ask loved ones whether something is safe, whether they sounded rude, whether they are a good person, whether a symptom seems serious, whether an event definitely happened the way they remember. Reassurance can feel like support, but in OCD it often becomes part of the ritual system. It soothes the doubt briefly, then teaches the brain to ask again later. Loved ones can get pulled into the cycle without realizing it, becoming assistants in a disorder they were only trying to comfort. Body dysmorphic disorder belongs in this broader family of obsessive-compulsive related conditions, and it shows how repetition and fixation can attach not only to danger, but to appearance. In body dysmorphic disorder, a person spends a great deal of time worrying about perceived flaws in appearance that are either minor or not noticeable to others. The distress is real and can have a major impact on life, especially because the person may feel embarrassed, ashamed, and highly focused on mirrors, grooming, camouflage, comparison, or avoiding being seen. It does not mean the person is vain or self-absorbed. The condition is often upsetting, often begins in adolescence or young adulthood, and can lead to avoidance of social situations, school, work, or relationships, because the person feels exposed by a defect others may barely perceive or not perceive at all. The loop in body dysmorphic disorder has its own painful logic. The person checks the mirror for certainty and leaves feeling worse. They compare themselves to others and become more distressed. They seek cosmetic fixes, reassurance, angles, lighting, makeup, grooming routines, or internet searches, hoping the anxiety will settle. Often it does not. The flaw grows larger in mental importance, not smaller. Daily life starts getting organised around concealment and checking. Time disappears into grooming, avoidance, or self-surveillance. Someone may arrive late because they cannot stop adjusting one detail. They may avoid photos, dates, interviews, bright rooms, close conversation, or leaving the house without ritual preparation. In that sense, the disorder behaves much like OCD, offering brief relief through repetitive acts while steadily making the mind less free. Hoarding disorder is another related condition, and it is far more than being messy, sentimental, or bad at tidying up. It involves persistent difficulty discarding possessions, a perceived need to save them, and distress at the idea of parting with them, even when the accumulation is affecting daily life. The result is clutter that can congest living areas and interfere with cooking, bathing, sleeping, moving through the home, or using rooms for their intended purpose. Items may have little practical or monetary value, but to the person they may feel important, potentially useful, emotionally charged, or impossible to discard without deep discomfort. What looks from the outside like refusal or carelessness is often a painful decision-making problem mixed with strong emotional attachment, fear of waste, fear of regret, or a sense that throwing something away would be wrong. Hoarding can shape a life slowly and then suddenly. At first it may seem like a collection, a tendency, a habit of keeping too much. Over time the home becomes harder to use, relationships strain, shame grows, repairs are avoided because no one can come in. Help is refused because discarding feels like threat, not relief. In severe cases, people may be unable to sleep in a bed, cook in a kitchen, or let others enter the space. Family members often feel bewildered because the distress attached to getting rid of things seems irrational to them. But that distress is exactly what drives the disorder. The object is not just an object, it becomes tied to safety, identity, memory, possibility, or unbearable uncertainty about loss. Telling the person to simply throw things away is usually about as effective as telling someone with panic disorder to enjoy a small enclosed elevator and see how they get on. There are also body-focused repetitive behaviours, including trichotillomania, which is recurrent hair pulling, and excoriation disorder, which is recurrent skin picking. These may sound like bad habits until one understands how compulsive and damaging they can become. Trichotillomania involves repeated, difficult-to-resist urges to pull out hair from the scalp, eyebrows, eyelashes, or other areas. Skin picking disorder involves repetitive picking that can cause cuts, bleeding, bruising, scarring, infection, and considerable emotional distress. Both can happen automatically, almost outside awareness, or in more focused states during stress, boredom, tension, or shame. People may hide the effects with makeup, hats, hairstyles, clothing, false lashes, or avoidance of close contact. The behaviour may bring a momentary sense of relief, satisfaction, or release, followed by guilt, embarrassment, and renewed resolve to stop. Then, the urge returns. What makes these disorders so difficult is not only the act itself, but the sense of being pulled by an urge one cannot quite master. Many people with hair pulling or skin picking genuinely want to stop. They make promises to themselves. They hide tools, trim nails, avoid mirrors, or wear barriers. Yet the behaviour returns, often in states of stress or partial attention. This can be deeply demoralising. The person concludes that they must lack discipline, when in fact the behaviour has become linked to a strong and repetitive relief loop. Anxiety, boredom, tension, loneliness, shame, and even small imperfections in the skin or hair can become triggers. The mind says fix it, smooth it, pull it, remove it, and the hand obeys before the reflective part of the brain has fully stepped into the room. Across all these related disorders there is a common theme. The person is trying to solve an internal problem using repetition. The problem may be uncertainty, disgust, fear, guilt, appearance distress, tension, incompleteness, or the need for a sensation to feel just right. The repetitive act promises regulation. It says, do this and you will be safe, clean, certain, correct, calm, complete, or relieved. But the relief fades quickly because the brain learns from the act itself that the underlying threat was real. Repetition is therefore both the attempted solution and the mechanism that keeps the disorder alive. The person gets trapped in maintenance work for a fear that their own rituals are quietly preserving. Treatment makes sense once that loop is understood. For OCD, one of the best supported approaches is cognitive behavioral therapy that includes exposure and response prevention. This means gradually facing the feared thought, situation, or sensation while resisting the compulsion or reassurance ritual. It is not designed to be cruel. It is designed to teach the brain that anxiety can rise and fall without ritual, and that catastrophic predictions often do not come true. It also teaches something subtler, and perhaps even more important, that certainty is not required for life to continue. The NHS notes that therapy and medication can both be effective for OCD, and more severe cases may need a longer course of combined treatment. Medication, often with SSRIs, can also help reduce symptom intensity for some people. For body-focused repetitive behaviours, habit reversal training is often central. This approach builds awareness of triggers and urges, then helps the person develop competing responses and new habits that interrupt the old pattern. NHS guidance for skin picking and Mayo Clinic information on trichotillomania both point to talking therapies, often cognitive behavioural approaches with habit reversal, as important treatments. The process is practical and repetitive rather than magical. The person learns when the behaviour happens, what state they are in, what cues precede it, and how to put a different response in place. That may sound less dramatic than deep cinematic insight under soft lighting, but in real life it is often exactly the kind of grounded work that helps. Something else matters here too, and that is compassion without indulgence. These disorders thrive on secrecy, shame, and misunderstanding. They also thrive when everyone tiptoes forever around the rituals as if the rituals are sacred. Good care does not mock the person, but it also does not fully surrender life to the disorder's rules. It recognizes that the distress is real and that the compulsions are not simply chosen for fun, while still helping the person move toward flexibility, uncertainty tolerance, and less ritualized living. That can be hard for families because reassurance, accommodation, and helping with rituals can feel kind in the moment. In the long run, though, the kindest thing is often to support treatment rather than support the loop. What these disorders reveal, perhaps more clearly than almost any others, is how powerful repetition can be in shaping the mind. A thought repeated with fear becomes a threat. A behaviour repeated with relief becomes a rule. An urge repeated with compliance becomes a pattern that starts feeling like identity. Yet the same nervous system that learned those loops can also learn different ones. A person can learn not to check, not to wash, not to ask again, not to pick, not to pull, not to obey every signal that arrives with urgency. That learning is rarely quick, and it is not usually comfortable at first, but it is real. With treatment, many people find that the thoughts lose importance, the urges lose force, and life begins expanding again beyond the narrow corridors built by ritual. The mind does not become perfectly quiet, because no mind does, but it becomes less ruled by repetition. And once we see how the mind can get trapped in loops long after danger has faded, it becomes easier to understand another kind of suffering, one in which the problem is not a ritual built around fear, but a nervous system that continues reacting as though the danger never truly ended. That is where trauma and stress disorders begin to move into view, with memories, vigilance, and survival responses that do not always stay in the past where they belong. Trauma does something very particular to the mind. It does not simply create a bad memory and then place it neatly on a shelf with the rest of the difficult things a person has lived through. It can interrupt the ordinary process by which experience becomes past. Instead of filing the event away as something finished, the nervous system keeps treating it as unfinished business. The danger may be over. The body may not believe that. That is the central problem in trauma and stress disorders. The event ends, but the survival response does not fully stand down. A person may continue to feel watchful, tense, reactive, numb, disconnected, easily startled, or thrown back into vivid distress by reminders that seem small to everyone else. In that sense, trauma is not only about what happened, it is also about what keeps happening inside the body afterward. PTSD can develop after a person experiences or witnesses a life-threatening or deeply traumatic event, and when symptoms persist and interfere with daily life, clinicians may diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. Acute stress disorder can appear in the first month after trauma, while adjustment disorder can follow stressful life changes or events when the reaction is stronger than expected and starts affecting functioning. A traumatic event can take many forms. It may be assault, abuse, war, a serious accident, a disaster, a difficult medical event, the sudden violent death of someone close, intensive care, domestic violence, sexual violence, or repeated childhood harm. NHS guidance also notes that certain occupations such as police work, paramedicine, healthcare and military service can carry greater exposure to traumatic events. Yet even when the same event happens to several people, they do not all respond in the same way. Many people have strong reactions after trauma and gradually recover. Others do not. That difference is not evidence of weakness or strength in the moral sense. It reflects a mix of factors: prior trauma, social support, age, biology, ongoing threat, sleep disruption, the meaning of the event, and whether the person has a safe place and enough support in which recovery can begin. About half of adults experience at least one traumatic event in life, but most do not develop PTSD. Immediately after trauma, the nervous system often behaves in ways that are intense, but still part of an acute stress response. A person may feel unreal, agitated, numb, shaky, detached, frightened, or unable to settle. They may replay the event, sleep badly, jump at noises, or feel as though the world has lost some of its ordinary safety. When this kind of severe distress occurs from 3 days up to 1 month after trauma, clinicians may consider acute stress disorder. The symptoms overlap with PTSD, but the timing is different. That distinction matters because it reminds us that the mind and body often react strongly at first, without that automatically becoming a long-term disorder. The problem becomes more serious when the symptoms do not ease, begin to organize daily life, and keep pulling the person back into survival mode long after the threat has passed. PTSD has several core features, and together they create a life that no longer feels fully in the present. One group of symptoms involves re-experiencing. The person may have flashbacks, intrusive memories, vivid images, nightmares, or sudden waves of distress that make the event feel close again. NHS describes re-experiencing as one of the most typical symptoms. Another group involves avoidance. The person begins staying away from places, people, conversations, sensations, media, or even thoughts that might stir the trauma. A third group involves heightened arousal. Sleep becomes difficult. Irritability rises. Startle responses become stronger. Hypervigilance appears, which means the person is scanning constantly for danger and finds it hard to relax. There can also be changes in mood and thinking, including guilt, shame, emotional numbness, negative beliefs about oneself or the world, loss of interest, and difficulty feeling close to other people. PTSD symptoms can begin soon after trauma, but NHS also notes they may appear months or even years later. Hypervigilance is one of the clearest examples of the nervous system refusing to let go. In a dangerous environment, scanning for threat makes sense. It can save a life. In ordinary life afterward, it becomes exhausting. The person enters restaurants and immediately checks exits. They sit facing doors. They notice footsteps, shifts in tone, changes in facial expression. Strange cars, crowded spaces, slamming sounds, sudden movements, and anything that might suggest risk. Their body remains half prepared to respond. NHS lists feeling very anxious, looking for danger all the time, and being easily startled as common PTSD symptoms. This constant state of readiness affects sleep, concentration, digestion, patience, and relationships. It's hard to enjoy a conversation or a quiet evening when some part of the brain is still acting as if it has been hired as security for an event no one else knows is happening. The body keeps score in simpler, less poetic ways too. Trauma-related disorders often come with headaches, stomach pain, body pain, chest tightness, fatigue, and disrupted sleep. NHS notes that PTSD can include repeated headaches, tummy problems, and pain without a clear physical cause. This does not mean the symptoms are imaginary. It means the stress systems that influence pain, muscle tension, sleep, digestion, and alertness have stayed activated for too long. The body begins living as though emergency is the baseline. Cortisol, adrenaline, muscle tension, shallow breathing, poor sleep, and constant readiness wear a person down. They may look functional. Inside, they are spending enormous energy simply trying not to be overwhelmed by reminders, sensations, dreams, and vigilance. Avoidance is the other major engine that keeps trauma disorders going. A person avoids roads, hospitals, smells, songs, neighborhoods, touch, intimacy, sleep, conversations, paperwork, news reports, family events, or silence itself because each one may contain a thread leading back to the trauma. This is understandable. Avoidance often works in the short term. It lowers distress. The nervous system calms a little, but it also teaches the brain that the reminder really was dangerous and that escape was the reason survival continued. Over time, the person's world can shrink around this lesson. Life becomes organized around not feeling triggered. A person may stop driving after an accident, stop dating after assault, stop sleeping because nightmares come, stop attending appointments after a medical trauma, or stop trusting people because closeness now feels like exposure. The trauma begins shaping the map of the future, not just the memory of the past. PTSD is considered when symptoms continue and begin interfering with relationships, work, or other aspects of daily life. There is also dissociation, which can be one of the strangest and loneliest parts of trauma. A person may feel detached from themselves, from the room, from other people, or from the sense that life is fully real. NHS notes that complex PTSD can involve feeling disconnected from yourself and the world around you. Dissociation can be protective in the moment of trauma because it dulls what would otherwise be overwhelming. Later, however, it can appear in everyday life as spacing out, emotional shutdown, memory gaps, or a feeling of moving through glass. People sometimes describe it as being present physically but not fully there. This is especially confusing because it can happen even when there is no obvious danger in the room. The nervous system has simply learned that disconnection is one of its escape routes. Complex PTSD adds another layer. NHS explains that complex PTSD has many of the core symptoms of PTSD, but is usually linked to repeated or prolonged trauma from which escape was difficult, such as childhood abuse, neglect, torture, captivity, or ongoing domestic abuse. Alongside flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance, and hypervigilance, people may experience persistent shame, worthlessness, guilt, emotional dysregulation, dissociation, and difficulty trusting or connecting with others. This makes sense when you think about the kind of learning repeated trauma produces. If a person is harmed again and again, especially during development or within close relationships, the nervous system does not just learn that one event was dangerous. It may learn that the world is unsafe, the self is powerless or contaminated, emotions are dangerous, and closeness comes with risk. Then the disorder reaches beyond memory into identity, attachment, and the way a person understands nearly every relationship that follows. children and teenagers often show trauma differently from adults, which matters because early suffering is easily misunderstood. NHS notes that younger children may reenact the trauma in play, become clingy, refuse sleep, wet the bed, lose interest in things they used to enjoy, or talk more about death and dying. Adults looking from the outside may see behavioural problems, moodiness, attention issues, or school refusal, when what they are actually witnessing is a nervous system trying to cope with something too large for the child to process directly. Childhood trauma can affect not only present distress but later emotional regulation, trust, self-esteem, relationships, and vulnerability to future mental health problems. When the systems for safety, attachment, and self-soothing develop under threat, they often carry that shape forward. The body grows older, the alarm rules remain young. Not every stress-related disorder begins with life-threatening trauma. Adjustment disorder is different. Medline Plus describes it as a group of symptoms such as stress, anxiety, sadness, hopelessness, and physical symptoms that develop after a stressful life event, when the reaction is stronger than expected and coping becomes difficult. The stressor may be divorce, job loss, conflict, illness, moving, financial pressure, caregiving, a breakup, or another major change. The person feels overwhelmed, not because the event was necessarily catastrophic in the trauma sense, but because the mind and nervous system cannot absorb the change smoothly. Adjustment disorder is often short-term, but while it lasts, it can affect sleep, mood, physical comfort, alcohol use, work, and relationships. In other words, stress does not have to reach the level of terror to begin shaping a life. Sometimes repeated strain, loss, or upheaval is enough to push the system past what it can manage well. What all these conditions share is that the nervous system keeps acting on old danger or current overload in ways that no longer fit the present moment. The person may know they are safe and still not feel safe. That split is deeply important. Trauma disorders are not failures of intelligence. A person can explain their symptoms beautifully and still have them. The thinking mind and the threat system are not always operating on the same clock. One says, the war is over, the crash is over, the abuse ended, the scan is complete, the surgery is done, the house is quiet. The other says perhaps, but I would still prefer not to sleep, trust, relax, sit with my back to the door, or hear that song in public ever again. Recovery often depends on helping those systems come back into closer agreement. Treatment can help a great deal. NIMH and the NHS both note that the main treatments for PTSD are psychotherapy, medication, or a combination of the two. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy and EMDR are among the therapies commonly recommended, and the NHS notes that these may also be offered for complex PTSD. Antidepressants are sometimes used as well, particularly when symptoms are persistent or severe. Good treatment does not force a person to relive everything dramatically in a single sitting while a therapist nods in grave lighting. It usually involves building safety, understanding triggers and symptoms, learning skills for regulation, and processing traumatic memories in a way that helps them become more truly past. For many people, recovery is not forgetting. It is remembering without being pulled under every time the memory appears. Recovery also depends on practical things that are easy to underestimate. Sleep matters, stability matters, safe relationships matter, reduced exposure to ongoing threat matters. A person cannot fully teach their body that danger is over while danger is still happening every week. The world around the nervous system influences what healing is possible. That is one reason trauma care is not just about insight. It is also about safety, housing, support, pacing, and not being blamed for having a body that learned survival too well. Some people improve quickly, some do not. Some need months, some need years. Some discover that what they thought was anxiety, irritability, or a difficult personality was trauma all along. Naming the pattern can be painful, but it can also bring relief. The symptoms stop looking random. They begin to make sense. and once they make sense, they can be approached with more precision and less shame. Perhaps the hardest truth in all of this is that trauma disorders are built out of survival. The flashback, the shutdown, the anger, the numbness, the startle, the avoidance, the disconnection, the sleeplessness, even the strange body sensations are not signs that the person is defective. They are signs that the system did exactly what it knew how to do under pressure, and then had trouble returning. The nervous system protected first and asked questions later. Unfortunately, later can last a very long time. Still, that same system can relearn. It can come to recognize safety again, though often slowly and with repetition. The body can stop interpreting every raised voice, hallway sound, or remembered image as evidence that the worst is beginning all over again. Life can widen, rest can return. The past can lose some of its power to walk into the present wearing new clothes. And once we understand how stress and trauma can shape memory, identity, and the sense of reality around a person, it becomes easier to turn toward another set of conditions where reality itself can begin to feel fractured in a different way, through hallucinations, delusions, and the unsettling experience of not being able to rely on perception in the ordinary shared sense. When people talk about losing touch with reality, the phrase can sound dramatic, almost theatrical, as though it belongs only to fiction or to the most extreme edges of medicine. In real life, psychosis is usually far more unsettling, intimate and confusing than dramatic. It is not a performance. It is an experience in which perception, belief, thought, or interpretation no longer line up reliably with shared reality. A person may hear voices no one else hears, believe things that are not true in a way that feels utterly convincing, or struggle to think and speak clearly enough for ordinary conversation to hold together. Psychosis is not itself a single diagnosis. It is a set of symptoms that can appear in several conditions, including schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, severe mood disorders, substance-related conditions, and some medical or neurological illnesses. The core idea is that reality begins to fracture in a way the person cannot easily correct from the inside. That point matters because psychosis is often misunderstood as meaning a person is simply irrational, dangerous, or beyond reach. None of those assumptions is reliable. NHS describes psychosis as losing some contact with reality, often involving hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thinking, while NIMH notes that early signs can include suspiciousness, social withdrawal, trouble thinking clearly, sleep disruption, confused speech, and a drop in functioning. The person is not choosing to misread reality for effect. Their brain is processing information differently, and that difference can be frightening, especially because insight is often reduced during an episode. In other words, the person may not realize that what they are seeing, hearing, or believing is part of an illness. From their point of view, the experience often feels real, urgent, and internally coherent, even when it looks deeply confusing from the outside. Hallucinations are one of the best-known symptoms, though people tend to think of them too narrowly. NIMH and the NHS both note that hallucinations can involve hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, or feeling things that are not there, with hearing voices being especially common in schizophrenia and other psychotic states. A person may hear one voice or many. The voices may comment, criticize, threaten, argue, command, or simply speak as though they belong to the ordinary world. For the person experiencing them, the voices are not usually vague symbols floating politely in the background. They can feel immediate, intrusive, and convincing. That can make ordinary tasks difficult. Imagine trying to shop for groceries, answer a question, or sit through a meeting while a private unwanted broadcast is speaking over the entire event. It is exhausting, frightening, and often isolating. Delusions are another core feature. NIMH defines them as strong beliefs that are not objectively true and may seem irrational to others, while the NHS describes them as believing things that are not actually true. The content can vary. A person may believe they are being watched, poisoned, targeted, followed, or sent messages through television, radio, or ordinary conversation. They may believe they have special powers, a unique mission, a secret identity, or a role in events of enormous importance. The belief is not usually held with the light uncertainty of a passing idea. It often arrives with conviction, and arguments from others may fail to change it because the delusion is woven into the person's interpretation of events. Random details begin to look connected. Neutral expressions appear threatening. Coincidences feel intentional. The world becomes full of signals, and the mind starts reading meaning everywhere. Disorganized thinking and speech are less famous in public imagination, but they matter a great deal. Psychosis can affect how thoughts are linked, how ideas are expressed, and how language is organized. NIMH notes that psychosis and schizophrenia can involve unusual ways of thinking and trouble communicating, and the NHS describes confused or disordered thinking and speech as part of psychosis. A person may jump between topics, respond in ways that do not quite connect to the question, speak in fragments, or use language that sounds hard to follow. Sometimes the thoughts are moving too quickly in unusual directions. Sometimes the person is trying to explain an experience that feels completely real to them, but no longer fits the shared rules of everyday logic. This is not the same as being eccentric, creative, or distracted. It is disruption in the structure of thought itself, and it can make the simplest human exchanges unexpectedly difficult. Psychosis also includes symptoms that are quieter and easier to misread. In schizophrenia, the NHS and NIMH both describe so-called negative symptoms, including reduced emotional expression, low motivation, withdrawal from other people, reduced speech, and difficulty carrying out everyday tasks or self-care. These symptoms can appear before the more obvious psychotic features, sometimes developing gradually over months or years. Family members may think the person has become lazy, rude, detached, or uninterested. In reality, the illness may already be altering motivation, emotional responsiveness, cognition, and social engagement. This early period is sometimes called the prodromal phase. It can look subtle from the outside: worse sleep, more time alone, odd ideas, poorer grades, less self-care, more suspiciousness, and a general sense that the person is becoming less like themselves in ways no one can quite name at first. Schizophrenia is the psychotic disorder most people know by name, and it carries a great deal of misunderstanding. NIMH describes it as a serious mental illness that affects how a person thinks, feels, and behaves, and may make them appear to have lost touch with reality. WHO notes that schizophrenia is characterized by significant impairments in perception and changes in behavior, and can include persistent delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, highly disorganized behavior, agitation, and difficulties with cognitive functioning. It is usually first diagnosed after a first episode of psychosis in late adolescence or early adulthood, commonly between ages 16 and 30. The condition varies widely between individuals. Some people have repeated episodes with long, stable periods in between. Others have more persistent symptoms. Some respond very well to treatment. Others need more support over time. Schizophrenia is serious, but it is not the simple sentence of permanent hopelessness that stigma often suggests. It is also important to say plainly that psychotic disorders are not defined only by crisis scenes. They affect daily living in slower ways too. Cognition can be impaired. Motivation can drop. Social life can narrow. Ordinary planning becomes harder. WHO specifically notes persistent difficulties with cognitive functioning in schizophrenia, and NIMH includes reduced motivation, emotional flattening, and difficulty with social relationships among common symptoms. The person may struggle to keep up with school, work, bills, hygiene, and appointments. This does not necessarily mean they no longer care. Very often they do care, but the machinery needed to organise action, stay emotionally connected and sort relevant from irrelevant information is under strain. Friends and relatives may misread this as indifference. That misunderstanding can deepen isolation at exactly the moment support matters most. Psychosis can also appear in other disorders. Psychotic depression, for example, is a severe form of depression in which psychotic symptoms occur alongside a major depressive episode. The NHS notes that treatment often involves both antidepressants and antipsychotics, sometimes along with talking therapy and social support. Schizoaffective disorder includes features of both psychosis and a mood disorder, such as depression or bipolar disorder, while some bipolar episodes can also include psychotic symptoms. This matters because the presence of hallucinations or delusions does not automatically mean schizophrenia. The broader pattern matters: what the mood is doing, how long the psychotic symptoms last, whether they occur only during mood episodes or outside them, and what else is happening medically or chemically in the person's life. Diagnosis in this area is careful partly because the same surface symptom can belong to more than one condition. Another difficult truth is that people experiencing psychosis are often frightened. NHS notes that people having psychotic episodes may be unaware that their hallucinations or delusions are not real, which can leave them distressed and fearful. If someone believes they are under threat, being watched, poisoned, or sent messages, their reactions may make sense within that terrifying frame. Suspicion, withdrawal, defensiveness, agitation, and avoidance are not random quirks in that situation. They are attempts to cope with a world that feels altered and unsafe. This is why arguing harshly or mocking the belief usually does not help. The person is not simply choosing a weird opinion. Their reality testing is impaired, and the experience often feels more convincing to them than any reassurance offered from the outside. Families often see the consequences before they understand the cause. A person may begin sleeping less, isolating more, neglecting self-care, speaking oddly, acting suspicious, laughing at nothing obvious, or losing their usual rhythm at school or work. NIMH lists social withdrawal, reduced self-care, sleep disruption, trouble thinking clearly, and a sudden drop in grades or job performance among early signs of psychosis. These changes can be mistaken for stress, substance use, rebellion, laziness, or a phase that will pass if everyone simply ignores it long enough. Sometimes they do pass. Sometimes they mark the beginning of a first episode of psychosis. The difference matters because early treatment is associated with better outcomes, and both the NHS and early intervention services emphasise getting help as soon as possible. Stigma makes all of this worse. One of the most persistent myths is that psychotic disorders automatically make a person violent or dangerous. The NHS specifically notes that most people who experience psychotic episodes are not a danger to others. That statement matters because fear tends to erase nuance. People hear the word schizophrenia and imagine only the most dramatic cases. They forget that many people with psychotic disorders are much more likely to be frightened, marginalised, unemployed, lonely or neglected than to fit the stereotype built by headlines and poor television writing. WHO also emphasises that during humanitarian and public health emergencies, people with schizophrenia are especially vulnerable to neglect, homelessness, abuse and exclusion. In other words, these are not conditions best understood through fear. They are conditions best understood through careful treatment, support, and the recognition that reality can become unreliable in ways that profoundly disrupt ordinary life. Treatment can help a great deal. The NHS states that psychosis is generally treated with a combination of antipsychotic medication, psychological therapies, and social support, and that first episode psychosis may be managed by early intervention teams. NIMH likewise notes that effective treatments for schizophrenia are available and can help people remain in school, maintain employment, achieve independence, and enjoy personal relationships. Treatment is not just about reducing voices or delusions, though that is often central. It is also about sleep, routine, housing, family education, occupational support, relapse prevention, and rebuilding daily function after reality has become unstable. The goal is not merely to quiet symptoms enough for survival. The goal is to help the person re-enter ordinary life with as much independence, dignity, and stability as possible. Medication is often one part of that work, especially antipsychotic medicines, which WHO includes in its guidance for psychotic disorders. But medication alone is rarely the whole story. The NHS emphasises multidisciplinary care, and NIMH highlights the value of comprehensive support. People may need help with understanding the illness, recognising warning signs, reducing stress, returning to work or study, rebuilding routines, and repairing trust in themselves and others. Someone who has lived through psychosis may not simply bounce back because symptoms are reduced. They may be grieving lost time, ashamed of things that happened during an episode, frightened of relapse, or uncertain how much of their own perception to trust. Recovery therefore involves both symptom management and the slower work of re-establishing a life. There is also a delicate human problem at the centre of psychotic disorders, and it is this. When perception itself becomes unreliable, a person can lose confidence not only in the world, but in their own mind. That loss can be devastating. We all rely on our thoughts and senses as the basic instruments by which we navigate reality. If those instruments begin producing experiences that others do not confirm, the result can be fear, shame, anger, and a lonely kind of confusion. Some people later describe feeling as though the world became coded, intensified, or haunted by meaning. Others remember mostly the exhaustion of trying to survive while everything familiar felt slightly wrong. Both the dramatic and the quiet versions are real. Psychosis does not always look like a crisis scene. Sometimes it looks like a person slowly disappearing behind suspicion, withdrawal, and strange certainty. Yet even here, the picture is not hopeless. Many people improve, especially with earlier care and sustained support. Some have one episode and recover well. Some live with recurring symptoms but build meaningful, stable lives. Some need long-term community treatment. Some need periods of hospital care. The course varies, and that variation is important because hopelessness is one of the most damaging myths around psychotic disorders. These illnesses are serious, but they are not the end of personhood. The person still exists beneath the fear, confusion, and perceptual distortion. Treatment works best when it protects that truth, when it responds not only to the symptoms but to the human being trying to find steady ground again. And once we have looked at what happens when reality itself begins to fracture, it makes sense to turn toward a different category of suffering, one that is less about losing touch with reality and more about enduring patterns of feeling, identity, and relationship that become so rigid they shape a whole life from the inside. That brings us toward personality disorders, where the difficulty is often not one episode or one symptom cluster, but long-standing ways of coping, connecting, and experiencing the self that can cause pain over many years. Some mental disorders arrive in episodes. They surge, peak, and sometimes recede. Personality disorders are different. They are not usually best understood as one period of illness interrupting an otherwise familiar self. They are deeper, more enduring patterns in the way a person experiences themselves, relates to other people, regulates emotion, interprets events, and responds under stress. NIMH describes personality disorders as enduring patterns of inner experience and behaviour that differ markedly from cultural expectations, remain relatively fixed across time and situations, and lead to distress or impairment. The NHS puts it more simply. A person with a personality disorder thinks, feels, behaves, or relates to others very differently from the average person. That does not mean the person is strange in every moment or incapable of normal life. It means certain patterns are persistent enough, rigid enough, and costly enough that they begin shaping relationships, identity, and daily functioning over many years. This is one reason personality disorders can be hard to understand, both for the person living with them and for everyone around them. The features often look like personality itself, Someone is always intense, always suspicious, always guarded, always seeking reassurance, always reactive to rejection, always avoidant, always grandiose, always rigid, always drawn into chaotic relationships, always struggling with anger or emptiness or closeness or shame. Because the pattern is long-standing, people may not think of it as a disorder at all. They may think, that is just who I am, or that is just how they are. In reality, the issue is not that the person has a personality, since everyone does. The issue is that certain ways of coping, attaching, and interpreting become so fixed that they repeatedly produce suffering, instability, and conflict. The person does not simply have traits, the traits begin running the room. It helps to think of personality as the long-term style of a mind. It includes emotional habits, relationship patterns, self-image, expectations of others, and the ways a person tends to manage threat, disappointment, intimacy, and frustration. In most people, these patterns have some flexibility. A person can be shy and still warm up, careful and still spontaneous, confident and still able to admit fault, sensitive and still able to recover from criticism. With personality disorders, that flexibility is reduced. The pattern shows up across settings and often feels deeply automatic. The person may keep reaching for the same strategies even when those strategies repeatedly damage relationships, work, or self-respect. And because these are not just symptoms that flare and vanish but ways of being that organize experience, treatment is often slower and more relational than it is with some other conditions. Causes are not simple, and it is better to say that early life shapes vulnerability than to pretend one event explains everything. The NHS notes that personality disorders are thought to result from a combination of inherited factors and early environmental influences, including distressing childhood experiences such as abuse or neglect. That does not mean everyone with a hard childhood develops a personality disorder, and it does not mean every person with a personality disorder had the same kind of past. But it does fit with a broader truth about the nervous system. Repeated experiences teach people what to expect from others, what emotions are safe to feel, whether closeness brings comfort or danger, whether mistakes lead to repair or humiliation, and whether the self feels stable or fragile. Over time, those lessons can harden into personality patterns. A person may learn that it is safer never to trust, safer never to need, safer always to control, safer always to please, safer to attack before being hurt, or safer to cling because abandonment feels unbearable. What began as adaptation can become an enduring style. The area where personality disorders become especially visible is relationship. That is not because people with these conditions are uniquely difficult or dramatic by nature, but because human relationships are where needs, fears, boundaries, shame, longing, and identity all get activated at once. If someone fears abandonment intensely, relationships can swing between dependence and anger. If someone expects rejection, they may withdraw before closeness has a chance to grow. If someone protects a fragile self-image through superiority, entitlement, or blame, conflict tends to follow. If someone struggles with empathy and remorse, the people around them may feel used or unsafe. If someone needs order and control so strongly that flexibility feels dangerous, everyday life can become rigid and exhausting. The pattern does not stay private. It enters friendships, partnerships, parenting, work, and care. Personality disorders have a big effect not only on the person's life, but also on family and friends. Borderline personality disorder is the most widely recognized example, and also one of the most stigmatized. NIMH describes it as a serious mental illness that severely affects emotional regulation, increases impulsivity, changes how a person feels about themselves, and negatively affects relationships. The NHS describes 4 broad areas: emotional instability, disturbed patterns of thinking or perception, impulsive behaviour, and intense but unstable relationships. People may experience rapid mood shifts, long-term feelings of emptiness, terror of abandonment, intense anger, self-harm, impulsive behaviour, and at times transient stress-related paranoia or other unusual experiences. The pattern often emerges by adolescence and can persist into adulthood. From the outside, this can look chaotic. From the inside, it often feels like living without reliable emotional skin. Rejection hurts too much, closeness feels desperately needed and frightening at the same time, and the self can feel unstable from hour to hour. One of the hardest things about borderline personality disorder is how quickly emotional states can reorganize the whole inner world. NNHS guidance notes that moods may swing in unpredictable ways, with intense episodes of rage, sorrow, shame, panic, terror, emptiness, and loneliness. Relationships can take on a go away, please don't go quality, where fear of abandonment and fear of being smothered alternate painfully. That pattern is confusing not only for partners, friends, and clinicians, but also for the person living inside it. They may crave closeness and then feel endangered by it. They may idealize someone and then feel devastated or furious when disappointment arrives. Self-harm and suicidal crises can occur, not as simple bids for attention, but as desperate attempts to regulate emotional pain that feels unbearable. NIMH also notes higher rates of self-harm and co-occurring conditions such as depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, bipolar disorder, and eating disorders. Treatment for borderline personality disorder is one of the clearest examples that personality disorders are not hopeless, even when they are severe. The NH states that many people with BPD benefit from treatment, and that over time many overcome their symptoms and recover. Treatment often involves psychotherapy delivered by trained professionals, sometimes for a year or more, and may include community mental health support. NIMH highlights dialectical behaviour therapy among the established treatments being studied and used. DBT is especially important because it focuses on emotion regulation, distress tolerance, mindfulness, and interpersonal effectiveness. In plain language, it helps people survive strong feelings without destroying themselves or their relationships in the process. That matters because one of the great injuries of stigma is the false idea that people with borderline personality disorder do not improve. Many do, especially with skilled, steady treatment. Not all personality disorders look like emotional crisis. Some are quieter and can be hidden behind competence or distance. Avoidant personality patterns, for example, involve deep sensitivity to criticism, rejection, and embarrassment. The person may want connection but avoid it because exposure feels too risky. They may appear shy, cold, or uninterested, when in fact they are highly fearful of humiliation and exclusion. Dependent patterns involve difficulty making decisions, strong needs for reassurance, and fear of being unable to cope alone. Narcissistic patterns may involve grandiosity, entitlement, and a need for admiration. But beneath that, there is often a self-esteem system that is fragile and highly reactive to shame or failure. Obsessive-compulsive personality patterns, which are different from OCD, involve rigidity, perfectionism, control, and preoccupation with order, to the point that flexibility and ease are lost. Antisocial patterns can involve disregard for others, irresponsibility, aggression, and lack of remorse. The forms vary, but the shared theme is enduring difficulty in self and interpersonal functioning. That distinction between OCD and obsessive-compulsive personality traits is worth pausing over, because the names can mislead. OCD involves unwanted, intrusive thoughts and compulsions that feel distressing and alien. Obsessive-compulsive personality patterns are more about a person's style. Excessive perfectionism, checking, caution, rigidity, preoccupation with details, and difficulty tolerating flexibility or imperfection. The pattern may seem admirable in some settings at first. The person is organized, conscientious, reliable, and precise. But when taken too far, the same qualities begin interfering with relationships, spontaneity, delegation, pleasure, and the ability to adapt. Life starts feeling overmanaged. Other people feel controlled or criticised. The person themselves may feel chronically tense and dissatisfied because nothing is ever quite right enough to rest. A major challenge in understanding personality disorders is that they sit very close to moral judgment in everyday language. People are called manipulative, selfish, cold, clingy, dramatic, arrogant, impossible, controlling, toxic, or reckless. Sometimes their behaviour really does hurt other people, and that should not be denied. But reducing a pattern to an insult usually makes understanding worse. A person can be responsible for harmful behaviour and still be acting from a disordered system of coping. Those two facts can coexist. Someone with a personality disorder may need accountability, boundaries, and consequences. They may also need treatment, stability, and a serious attempt to understand how the pattern works. If everyone around them responds only with rejection or contempt, the condition often worsens. If everyone responds with endless accommodation and no limits, that may also worsen things. Good care usually lives in the uncomfortable middle, where compassion and boundary setting have to learn to share a table. Another difficulty is insight. People with personality disorders often suffer greatly, but they may not always identify the pattern in the way clinicians or loved ones do. This is partly because the pattern feels normal from the inside. If someone has always experienced closeness as dangerous, mistrust as necessary, control as safety, or admiration as essential to self-worth, they may not think this is a symptom. They may think, this is reality, or this is simply how people are. That's one reason relationships with therapists can become so important. Therapy is not only a place to talk about feelings, it is a place where patterns appear in real time. Fear of abandonment, shame, withdrawal, anger, idealization, dependency, mistrust, or control can all show up in the therapeutic relationship itself, where they can gradually be named and worked with rather than simply acted out again. The consequences of these disorders can be broad. The NHS notes that personality disorders can have a big effect on the person's life, as well as on family and friends. Work may become unstable because conflict, impulsivity, perfectionism, suspiciousness, or emotional volatility interfere with routine. Relationships may become intense, brief, avoidant, or chronically strained. Self-harm, suicidal thoughts, substance use, depression, and anxiety can accompany the personality pattern rather than existing separately from it. NNIM8 notes that people with borderline personality disorder in particular often also experience depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders, substance use disorder, bipolar disorder, or eating disorders. In other words, personality disorders do not sit quietly in one corner of the diagnostic room. They often shape how other symptoms are experienced, managed, and interpreted. The way diagnosis is evolving also matters. The NHS explains that instead of always being diagnosed strictly by one named type, some people may now be diagnosed with mild, moderate, or severe personality disorder with particular personality traits. That reflects a broader shift toward thinking not only in rigid boxes, but in terms of severity and the particular features that dominate. The WHO's ICD-11 clinical guidance is built to support accurate diagnosis and appropriate care across settings worldwide. This movement is useful because real people rarely fit perfectly into one narrow category. A person may show traits of emotional instability, avoidance, suspicion, dependency, or perfectionism in overlapping ways. What matters most clinically is the degree of impairment, the self and relationship difficulties involved, and what kind of support will help. Medicine can play a role, but it is not the main cure for personality disorder itself. The NHS states that treatment usually involves talking therapy, and may also include other therapies and medicine, but medicine is generally prescribed for associated problems such as depression, anxiety, or psychotic symptoms. That makes sense because the core issues often involve long-standing patterns of emotion regulation, self-image, interpersonal functioning, and coping. Therapy, therefore, tends to be central. Depending on the condition and setting, treatment may involve DBT, mentalization-based therapy, schema therapy, or other approaches designed to increase stability, reflection, emotional regulation, and healthier relationship patterns. This kind of work usually takes time, months, often years. That does not mean it fails. It means deep patterns do not vanish because a person has one good insight on a Thursday afternoon and then buys a notebook. There is something else worth saying, especially because these diagnoses carry so much fear. Recovery does happen. The NHS explicitly says many people with personality disorder recover over time, and that treatment or support is often helpful. That sentence matters. It pushes back against the idea that these conditions are fixed character flaws. A person can become less reactive, more reflective, less impulsive, less avoidant, less rigid, more stable in relationship, more capable of tolerating shame, conflict, uncertainty, and closeness without falling apart or lashing out. The personality does not disappear. It becomes less trapped by old rules. A person can learn that not every criticism is annihilation, not every distance is abandonment, not every need is weakness, not every imperfection is disaster, not every relationship must swing between worship and ruin. Those are profound changes, and they often happen gradually enough that outsiders do not notice until life is already calmer. Perhaps that is the most humane way to understand personality disorders. They are not villains in diagnostic form. They are long-standing adaptations, defenses, sensitivities, and expectations that became too rigid and too costly. They can make a life stormier, lonelier, harsher, and more confusing. They can also soften with treatment, support, and time. The mind learns early, and sometimes it learns the wrong lessons too well. But it can still learn again. And from here, it makes sense to turn toward another form of suffering in which emotion, self-image, and control become bound tightly to food, appetite, and the body itself, often in ways that look from the outside like discipline or choice, but are underneath another serious pattern of distress. Eating disorders are often misunderstood because from the outside they can look like habits, preferences, discipline, fussiness, vanity, or just a phase that has gone too far. In reality, they are serious mental health conditions involving severe disturbances in eating behaviour, intense distress around food, weight, or shape, and patterns that can damage both physical health and daily functioning. The NHS describes them as conditions in which a person uses control of food to cope with feelings and other situations, while NIMH notes that they can be life-threatening and are often linked with other mental illnesses such as anxiety, depression, and substance use disorders. They are not a choice, and they are not simply about liking a certain body type more than another. They are disorders of mind and body together, and once they take hold, they can quietly begin reorganizing an entire life. One reason they are so hard to spot is that eating is ordinary. Everyone eats, thinks about food, notices their body, has preferences, and sometimes feels self-conscious. That familiarity makes it easy to miss the point where something crosses from ordinary concern into illness. A person may start skipping meals, exercising more, hiding food, eating in secret, feeling shame after eating, obsessively checking their body, or building strict rules around what is allowed and what is not. At first, these changes may even be praised. Discipline, clean eating, getting in shape, being careful, having standards. The culture is often so comfortable admiring control that it can fail to notice when control has turned into fear. By the time others realize something is wrong, the disorder may already be shaping sleep, concentration, relationships, mood, and the person's sense of self. It is important to say plainly that eating disorders are not all the same. The NHS lists anorexia nervosa, bulimia, and binge eating disorder as common types, and also notes that OSFD, other specified feeding or eating disorder, is actually the most common eating disorder when symptoms do not fit neatly into one named category. NIMH also highlights avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID, which is different from the body image-driven forms because the restriction is linked more to fear of eating, fear of choking or vomiting, lack of interest in food, or sensory aversion to texture, smell, taste, or appearance. This matters because people often imagine eating disorders as one narrow picture, usually a very thin young woman obsessing over weight. In truth, anyone can get an eating disorder, and the surface appearance of the person may tell you much less than you think. Anorexia nervosa is one of the most recognised forms, and also one of the most medically dangerous. The NHS describes it as an eating disorder in which people try to keep their weight as low as possible by not eating enough, exercising too much, taking laxatives, or making themselves sick, and notes that this can make them very ill because they begin to starve. NIMH adds that people with anorexia often show extreme restriction, an intense fear of gaining weight, distorted body image, and denial of the seriousness of their low body weight. A person may look in the mirror and still believe they're too large even when they are medically underweight. That is one of the most painful parts of the disorder. The body is weakening, but the mind is still arguing that the danger is not the weight loss, only the possibility of gaining it back. The effects of anorexia move far beyond hunger. NIMH lists serious consequences including thinning bones, anemia, muscle wasting, constipation, low blood pressure, slowed breathing and pulse, damage to the heart, infertility, brain damage, multiple organ failure, and a risk of death from medical complications associated with starvation. WHO similarly notes that anorexia often begins in adolescence or early adulthood and is associated with premature death due to medical complications or suicide. This is why eating disorders are not best understood as diets gone wrong. A person may still be speaking, walking, attending school, posting online, and insisting they are fine, while their body is being forced to operate under conditions it was never meant to tolerate for long. The damage can remain hidden under clothes, under routines, under jokes, and under the illusion that the smaller the body becomes, the more in control the person must be. Bulimia nervosa looks different on the outside, and is often even easier to miss because a person may remain at what others consider an average weight. The NHS describes bulimia as losing control over how much you're eating over a short period of time, and then trying to rid the body of the food through vomiting, laxatives, diuretics, fasting, excessive exercise, or a combination of these. NIMH likewise describes bulimia as a pattern of binge eating, followed by unhealthy compensatory behaviours meant to prevent weight gain. What makes bulimia so painful is the cycle. There is tension, craving, secrecy, loss of control, then panic, guilt, and an urgent attempt to undo what has happened. Relief may come briefly, but shame usually follows, and then the mind begins preparing for the next round. The physical consequences of bulimia can also be severe even when they are not obvious to other people. The NHS notes complications including damage to tooth enamel from stomach acid, damage to the throat, irregular or absent periods, bowel problems, seizures, weakened bones, and heart or kidney problems. It also notes that bulimia can become life-threatening without the right support. A person may look outwardly functional while their body is absorbing repeated stress from vomiting, electrolyte shifts, overuse of laxatives, undernourishment, sleep disruption, and chronic psychological distress. This is one of the quieter dangers in eating disorders. People often assume they can judge severity by how someone looks. The body does not always advertise its emergencies politely. Binge eating disorder is another major form, and it's often dismissed because many people confuse it with ordinary overeating. The difference is not simply quantity. The NSHS describes binge eating disorder as regularly eating a lot of food over a short period of time until uncomfortably full, with the person feeling out of control while it is happening. Mayo Clinic similarly notes that it involves repeated episodes of eating unusually large amounts in a specific amount of time, often very quickly, often alone or in secret, and often followed by shame, guilt, disgust, or depression. The person is not just eating too much at a holiday meal. They are caught in a cycle of compulsion, loss of control and distress, often with repeated attempts to restrict afterward that only strengthen the pattern. Binge eating disorder can affect people of any size, and that matters because stigma tends to blur the picture. The NHS notes that weight gain can occur, but not in everyone, while Mayo Clinic notes that some people with binge eating disorder are overweight or obese and some are not. NIMH lists potential health consequences including obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular problems, sleep problems, and gastrointestinal symptoms. But the suffering is not only metabolic, it is also emotional. The secrecy, self-disgust, repeated vows to stop, and feeling of being overrun by one's own eating can erode confidence and isolate a person from others. Because the behaviour may happen behind closed doors, many people carry it privately for years while being judged from the outside as lacking willpower. That judgment misses the structure of the disorder entirely. ARFID shows even more clearly that eating disorders are not always about wanting to be thin. The NHS says ARFID involves avoiding certain foods, limiting how much is eaten, or both, and that beliefs about weight or body shape are not the reasons people develop it. NIMH describes ARFID as restriction, driven by anxiety about eating, fear of choking or vomiting, dislike of food characteristics, lack of appetite or limited interest in food, and notes that it can lead to weight loss, malnutrition, growth problems, and impairment in school, work, or relationships. In everyday life, this can look like very limited safe foods, panic around unfamiliar meals, conflict at family tables, embarrassment in social settings, and a body that is not getting what it needs because eating has become wrapped in fear or sensory distress rather than appetite and nourishment. That point is worth lingering on because it helps break one of the most stubborn myths in this area. Eating disorders are not always about appearance, and even when they are not really only about appearance. They are often about control, fear, shame, numbness, identity, perfectionism, self-punishment, coping, and the desperate attempt to manage inner distress through food, or the refusal of it. The NHS explicitly links eating disorders with using the control of food to cope with feelings and other situations. A person may be trying to feel safe, pure, smaller, less needy, more in control, less visible, more disciplined, more worthy, or simply less overwhelmed. Food then becomes the instrument through which that emotional struggle is acted out. Hunger stops being just hunger. Fullness stops being just fullness. The body becomes a project, a battlefield, or sometimes a hiding place. Body image plays a central role in many of these disorders, but not in the simple way people imagine. It is not just vanity or a wish to look better in photographs. It is often a distorted relationship with the body itself. In anorexia, the person may genuinely experience their body in a way that does not match reality, seeing themselves as fat when underweight. In bulimia, weight and shape may become the main measures by which self-worth is judged. In binge eating disorder, shame about body size or shape can intensify the cycle rather than interrupt it. The body becomes less a place a person lives, and more a thing they monitor, fight, criticize, conceal, or try to conquer. Once that happens, eating is no longer just a biological process. It becomes morally loaded. Good and bad foods, good and bad bodies, good and bad days, all judged under rules that become harder and harder to satisfy. Because these disorders affect both body and mind, they often travel with other mental illnesses. NIMH notes that people with eating disorders are at risk for co-occurring depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, and suicide, while the NHS also notes risk factors including depression, anxiety, perfectionism, low self-esteem, family history, and criticism about body shape or weight. This helps explain why eating disorders can become so tightly woven into a person's life. The eating behavior is rarely the only problem. Under it there may be panic, trauma, obsessive thinking, shame, loneliness, compulsive self-criticism, or a persistent sense of not being enough. If treatment focuses only on food and ignores the emotional machinery beneath it, the disorder often finds a way to keep speaking through another symptom. Another reason eating disorders become entrenched is that they often reward themselves in the short term. Restriction may create a temporary sense of control, numbness, or accomplishment. Purging may bring brief relief from panic and guilt. Binge eating may briefly dull loneliness, anxiety, or emptiness. Avoidance in ARFID may bring temporary safety from feared textures, choking, or nausea. The problem is that the relief is short-lived and teaches the brain that the behavior worked. The mind learns to return to the same strategy again, even as the long-term cost rises. That is how an eating disorder can begin by seeming useful to the person and then slowly become the thing that is ruining their health, their relationships, and their freedom. The disorder is not irrational in its own internal logic. It is tragically effective in the moment and destructive over time. The social effects can be enormous. Meals become stressful, invitations are avoided, holidays become negotiation. The person may withdraw from friends, hide behaviors, lie about eating, or become irritable when routines are disrupted. School and work may suffer because concentration weakens, energy drops, appointments multiply, and so much mental space is spent thinking about food, body, calories, exercise, guilt, or escape plans. ARFID can interfere with family life and social activities because eating outside the safe pattern feels impossible. Bulimia and binge eating often involve secrecy and isolation. Anorexia can turn every shared meal into quiet conflict. Over time, the disorder does not just shape how a person eats. It shapes where they go, what they accept, what they fear, and how close they can bear to be to other people. Treatment is possible, and that matters because hopelessness is one of the most dangerous lies these disorders tell. NIMH states that eating disorders can be treated successfully, and that early detection and treatment are important for recovery. It recommends treatment plans that include psychotherapy, medical care and monitoring, nutritional counselling, and in some cases medication for bulimia or binge eating disorder or for co-occurring anxiety and depression. The NHS similarly says most people can recover, though recovery may take time and look different for each person, and that treatment usually includes talking therapy plus regular health checks if physical health is being affected. Some severe cases require hospital or residential care. This is not because the person has failed. It is because bodies pushed too far sometimes need immediate support before deeper psychological work can safely continue. Family and other close relationships can matter a great deal in recovery. NIMH notes that family can play a crucial role in treatment, and that family-based treatment can improve outcomes, particularly for adolescents. That is important because eating disorders thrive on secrecy, denial, and distorted self-assessment. A person may not realize how unwell they are, or may fiercely defend the behaviors because the disorder feels protective. Loved ones often walk a difficult line between being supportive and becoming trapped in the illness's routines and negotiations. Good treatment helps create something steadier, less shame, less argument over moral worth, more structure, more honesty, and more protection of the person's health, even when the disorder objects very loudly. The disorder may be using the body as its main language, but recovery usually requires more than one person listening carefully and responding consistently. Perhaps the saddest thing about eating disorders is how often they disguise themselves as success, discipline, health, or self-improvement right up until the cost becomes impossible to ignore. Restriction can look like admirable control. Over-exercise can look like commitment. Thinness can attract praise. Secret binging can be hidden behind humour or a normal public image. ARFID can be dismissed as picky eating. Bulimia can remain invisible for a long time. A person may even receive compliments while becoming more medically compromised and psychologically trapped. This is why early recognition matters so much. By the time the damage is obvious, the disorder has often already been teaching the mind and body its rules for quite a while, and those rules are hard to break, not because the person is weak, but because the illness has attached itself to identity, routine, and relief. At the center of all of this is a painful mismatch. The body needs food, stability, and care. The disorder tells the person that safety lies somewhere else, in less, in more, in undoing, in avoiding, in shrinking, in rigid control, in one more rule, one more purge, one more binge, one more day of pretending the body is not asking for help. Treatment slowly reverses that lie. It teaches that nourishment is not failure, that eating is not moral weakness, that body size is not a complete measure of worth, and that control built on self-damage is not really control at all. Recovery is rarely elegant. It is often repetitive, frustrating, and full of moments where the mind protests loudly while the body is being brought back into safer ground. But it is possible, and many people do get better with the right support. And once we have seen how control, appetite, fear, and self-image can shape eating in such powerful ways, it makes sense to move toward another group of conditions where the main question is not food or body image at all, but how the mind develops, focuses, organizes behavior, and relates to the world from early on. That brings us toward neurodevelopmental and behavioral disorders, where the differences often begin much earlier and affect attention, impulse control, communication, and the way a person grows into everyday life. Some minds struggle not because they are broken in the same way an infection breaks a lung or a fracture breaks a bone, but because they develop along a different path from the start. That is the broad territory of neurodevelopmental and behavioral disorders. These are conditions that begin early in life and affect how a person pays attention, regulates impulses, communicates, learns, manages emotion, or responds to the world around them. NIMH describes ADHD as a developmental disorder with persistent symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity that begin in childhood and can interfere with relationships in school or work. NIMH also describes autism as a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact, communicate, learn, and behave, with symptoms generally appearing in the first 2 years of life. In this part of the story, the question is often not what suddenly went wrong, but how a person's mind has been working differently for a very long time, sometimes before anyone had the right words for it. That difference matters because these conditions are very often mistaken for character flaws. A child is called lazy when they cannot organize tasks. A teenager is called rude when they miss social cues. A young adult is called careless, immature, difficult, too sensitive, too intense, too distractible, too literal, too restless, or too oppositional. The pattern is then explained as a personality problem rather than a developmental one. Yet official guidance is clear that these are not simply matters of willpower. ADHD symptoms usually begin before age 12 and include persistent problems with attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Autism is lifelong, not caused by bad parenting, not caused by vaccines, and not something a person grows out of simply because others wish they would behave more conveniently. These conditions may be noticed very early, or they may not be recognized until school, work, or adult life makes the mismatch harder to hide. ADHD is one of the clearest examples of how a different developmental pattern can shape ordinary life in dozens of small ways. NIMH defines it as a developmental disorder marked by persistent inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Some people mainly struggle with inattention, others mainly show hyperactivity and impulsivity. Many have both. The NHS notes that children and young people with ADHD may have trouble concentrating, sitting still, listening, following instructions, remembering everyday tasks, waiting their turn or interrupting less often. These are not tiny inconveniences when they happen all day. They affect homework, friendships, routines, sleep, family patience, and the child's own sense of competence. A person with ADHD is often trying hard, but the effort is being spent in a brain that loses track, jumps ahead, misses steps, and struggles to hold the line between intention and action. The child may want to do well and still leave the shoes in the fridge of daily life, metaphorically speaking, because attention and self-control are not landing where they need to. The effects of ADHD often continue well beyond childhood. NIMH notes that many adults also have the disorder and that some are only recognized later because teachers or family did not notice it earlier, the symptoms were milder, or they managed until adult demands became harder to carry. That is important because adult ADHD is often less about running around a classroom and more about chronic lateness, poor time management, forgetfulness, disorganization, impulsive spending, unfinished tasks, difficulty sustaining attention in conversation or reading, and the exhausting feeling of being bright enough to know what needs doing, but not consistently able to line up the doing with the knowing. The NHS also notes that ADHD may be recognized less often in girls because inattentive symptoms can be harder to spot. That means many people grow up assuming they are scattered, careless, or failing at ordinary life when in fact their brain has been handling attention and control differently all along. The injury is not only practical, it can settle into self-esteem, shame, and the quiet belief that one is always somehow behind. ADHD rarely travels alone. The NHS notes that people with ADHD may often have other conditions too, including depression, anxiety, addictions, dyslexia, autism, Tourette's, sleep problems, or learning difficulties. That overlap matters because the person's life rarely arrives in neat diagnostic boxes. The child who cannot focus may also be anxious. The adult who misses deadlines may also be depressed. The teenager who cannot settle may also be sleeping badly, and then being blamed for symptoms that exhaustion is making worse. This is one reason proper assessment matters. NIMH states that a clinician needs to do a thorough evaluation because stress, sleep disorders, anxiety, depression, and physical illnesses can cause similar symptoms, and diagnosis requires that ADHD symptoms be present for at least 6 months, begin in childhood, appear in more than one setting, and interfere with school, work, or relationships. In other words, the goal is not to hand out labels casually. It is to understand what pattern is truly shaping the person's life. The good news with ADHD is that support can make a very real difference. NIMH says that while there is no cure, treatment can reduce symptoms and improve functioning, and common approaches include medication, psychotherapy, behavioral interventions, parent education, and school-based support. The NHS adds practical strategies like breaking tasks into smaller parts, giving clear, simple instructions, creating visible to-do lists, encouraging regular sleep, exercise, and steady routines, and using medicines when appropriate under specialist supervision. That combination makes sense because ADHD affects both the internal regulation of the brain and the external structure of daily life. Some people benefit greatly from stimulant medication. Some benefit from coaching, CBT, or practical accommodations. Some need a quieter environment, fewer competing demands, or more visible planning tools. The point is not to force the person into a single standard shape. It is to help the world and the person meet in a way that reduces friction and allows strength to show up more reliably. Autism belongs to this same broad family of developmental difference, but it is not the same kind of difficulty. NIMH defines autism spectrum disorder as a neurological and developmental disorder affecting interaction, communication, learning, and behaviour, with signs generally appearing in the first 2 years of life. The NHS adds an important corrective to the way autism is often spoken about. Autism is not an illness. It means a person's brain works in a different way from other people. It is lifelong, and some autistic people need little or no support while others need help every day. That matters because autism is often described too narrowly either as tragedy or as quirk. In reality, it is a broad spectrum of differences in social communication, sensory processing, routines, interests, and information handling. Some people are diagnosed in early childhood because the signs are obvious. Others are not recognized until much later, especially if they have learned to copy social behavior, are verbally able, or have spent years masking their difficulties in order to get by. The everyday experience of autism can be very different from what outsiders imagine. According to the NHS, autistic people may find it hard to communicate and interact with other people, hard to understand how others think or feel, overwhelmed by bright lights or loud noises, upset by unfamiliar situations and social events, slower to process information, and likely to do or think the same things over and over. To an outside observer, this may look like aloofness, stubbornness, inflexibility, overreaction, or unusual intensity. Inside, though, it may feel more like living in a world whose rules are not clearly posted, where sensory input can be too sharp, where small changes are not small, and where predictability is not a preference, but a form of safety. Routine becomes helpful because it reduces cognitive strain. Repetition can soothe. Strong focused interest can bring pleasure, structure, and expertise. The difficulty is not that the person lacks a mind rich enough for life. It is that life is often designed around assumptions their nervous system does not share. The sensory side of autism is especially important and often poorly appreciated. NHS guidance notes that autistic people may find bright lights or loud noises overwhelming, stressful, or uncomfortable, and that unfamiliar situations can cause significant anxiety. This means that what looks from the outside like difficult behavior may sometimes be a response to overload rather than defiance. A crowded classroom, a noisy supermarket, a scratchy fabric, a change in routine, fluorescent lights, overlapping conversations, a strong smell, or an unexpected demand can all push the system beyond what it can organize comfortably. When that happens, the person may withdraw, shut down, repeat actions, become distressed, or lose the ability to communicate clearly for a time. That is not a moral failure. It is a nervous system under too much strain. Once you understand that, the right response shifts from punishment or ridicule towards support, predictability, environmental adjustment, and respect for the fact that not all distress announces itself in socially tidy ways. Autism also does not erase the possibility of a full life. The NHS explicitly says autistic people can live a full life, can have things they are good at as well as things they struggle with, and may need extra help with friendships, relationships, work, or daily life, rather than being excluded from those things altogether. It also notes that autistic people can have any level of intelligence and may or may not have a learning disability. Some autistic people have average or above average intelligence and strong abilities in memory, pattern recognition, focus, or particular areas of interest. Others need substantial daily support. The spectrum is wide. That is one reason autism can be missed in some people for years. A person may appear successful in school or work while paying a heavy private cost in exhaustion, confusion, masking, and burnout. Diagnosis later in life can therefore bring mixed feelings: grief for missed support, relief at finally having an explanation, and a rereading of one's entire past through a new lens. Neurodevelopmental conditions also include behavioral and regulatory problems that are broader than ADHD and autism. NIMH's developmental research programs explicitly include ADHD, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and other disorders of behavioral dysregulation, and NIMH describes disruptive mood dysregulation disorder as a condition in children and adolescents, involving ongoing irritability, anger, and frequent intense temper outbursts that are severe, present in multiple settings, and beyond ordinary moodiness. This is useful because children are often judged by the visible behavior without much curiosity about the systems underneath it. Not every irritable child has a disorder, and not every oppositional moment is pathological. But when anger, explosiveness, defiance, or dysregulation are persistent and disabling, something more than bad behaviour may be happening. The child may be struggling with frustration tolerance, language, sensory stress, trauma, ADHD, autism, mood problems, or patterns of regulation that are far weaker than the adults around them realise. A behaviour is visible. The mechanism behind it usually needs more careful listening. This broader point matters because development shapes the whole future. A child who is constantly corrected for symptoms may learn that they are naughty, lazy, weird, or disappointing. A teenager who cannot read social cues may become isolated. A student with ADHD may begin to fear effort because effort so often ends in failure or embarrassment. An autistic young person may become exhausted from trying to act normal in environments that never quiet down enough to feel safe. Over time, the secondary injuries pile up. Anxiety appears, depression appears, confidence drops, family conflict rises. School becomes a place of repeated misunderstanding rather than growth. That is why these conditions are not just about attention span, fidgeting, special interests, or tantrums. They are about how a mind grows in contact with other minds, and whether it is met with understanding, structure, ridicule, punishment, or impossible expectations. The effects can last far beyond childhood unless support changes the course. Assessment and diagnosis, when done carefully, can help redirect that course. NIMH emphasises that ADHD requires thorough evaluation because other conditions can look similar, and the NHS Autism Guidance notes that getting diagnosed can be helpful. That help is not just bureaucratic. A good diagnosis can change the meaning of years of struggle. The restless child is no longer simply too much. The distracted student is not just careless. The adult who has always felt socially out of step is not necessarily failing at being a person. The label is not the solution by itself, of course. It does not do homework, lower noise, improve school systems, or instantly create emotional insight in a tired family kitchen. But it can open the door to practical supports, treatments, accommodations, specialist advice, and above all a more accurate story about what has been happening. In mental health, accurate stories matter. They determine whether a person is shamed, dismissed, punished, understood, or helped. Perhaps the gentlest and most useful way to think about these disorders is this. Some minds develop with different balances of attention, impulse control, sensory processing, social understanding, emotional regulation, or behavioural control. Those differences can create real disability, real distress, and real practical consequences. They can also coexist with intelligence, humour, creativity, loyalty, unusual insight, persistence, and very specific kinds of strength. Support therefore works best when it does two things at once. It takes the impairment seriously, and it does not reduce the person to the impairment. A DHD may need structure, therapy, school support, or medication. Autism may need understanding, sensory adjustment, clearer communication, and practical support rather than endless pressure to perform normality. Severe irritability and behavioural dysregulation may need assessment, parent support, therapy, and a calmer environment. Once that is understood, the final part of this journey can slow down a little. We can step back from the diagnostic map and turn toward the larger human question beneath all of it. What suffering means, what healing really looks like, and why being understood can sometimes be the beginning of rest. By the time we reach a quieter place in a subject like this, there is a strong temptation to tidy everything up too neatly. To say that the mind suffers, but treatment exists, and so the lesson is simple. To say that people struggle, but help is available, and so all is well. To say that once we understand a disorder, we have somehow solved the mystery of the person carrying it. Real life is not usually that cooperative. Suffering is often messier than language. Healing is often slower than hope would prefer. Understanding is often partial, delayed, and mixed with misunderstanding for far longer than it should be. And yet, for all that untidiness, something important remains true. To be understood even a little more clearly can change the weight of suffering. It does not erase pain, but it often makes the pain less lonely, less confusing, and less shameful. That matters because one of the hardest parts of mental suffering is not only the symptom itself, but the private story built around it. A person with anxiety may decide they are weak. A person with depression may decide they are failing at life in some basic way that other people were somehow taught to do properly. A person with obsessive thoughts may begin to fear they are secretly dangerous or bad. A person with trauma may think they should be over it by now, and punish themselves for every reminder that the body still remembers. A person with psychosis may feel cut off from shared reality and from the trust that once made ordinary life feel stable. A person with an eating disorder may measure their worth by discipline and punishment until nourishment itself begins to feel morally suspect. A person with ADHD may build a lifelong identity around being careless, behind, or not trying hard enough. A person with a personality disorder may come to believe that closeness and pain are simply the same thing wearing different clothes. Those private stories can become almost as damaging as the disorder, not because the symptoms are imaginary, but because shame wraps itself around them and turns pain into a verdict. Instead of, "I am struggling," the person learns to think I am the struggle. Instead of, "This is a condition," they think this is my true nature, exposed at last. The mind is very skilled at taking a difficult pattern and converting it into identity. That conversion is not harmless. It changes what a person believes they deserve. It changes whether they ask for help. It changes how much hope they can tolerate without feeling foolish. It changes whether recovery feels like a real possibility or like something designed for other people with cleaner lives and better luck. This is why understanding matters so much. Not because explanation solves everything, but because explanation interrupts cruelty. When a person learns that panic is a false alarm rather than proof that they are collapsing, something changes. When a person learns that depression alters energy, concentration, sleep, and expectation, the state begins to look less like laziness and more like illness. When someone recognizes that trauma has kept their nervous system on guard, their reactions start making sense. When intrusive thoughts are understood as symptoms rather than secret desires, a terrible burden can lift. When ADHD is named, years of moral failure may be reclassified as a developmental difference that needed support. When autism is recognized, a lifetime of feeling out of step may become more understandable. Even in the more stigmatized conditions such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or borderline personality disorder, understanding can begin to replace fear with pattern, and pattern is easier to work with than nameless dread. There is a quiet dignity in being accurately seen, not stared at, not reduced, not diagnosed and filed away like a document in a cabinet no one will open again, but seen, properly. With enough precision to notice the real shape of the difficulty and enough humanity to remember that the difficulty is not the whole person. That kind of seeing is rarer than it should be. Many people are recognized only after they have become impossible to ignore, only after the crisis, the collapse, the self-harm, the weight loss, the manic spree, the breakdown at work, the academic failure, the relationship explosion, the hospitalization, the silence that has lasted too long. Before that point, they are often told they are dramatic, difficult, selfish, lazy, rigid, careless, cold, too sensitive, too emotional, too much, too little, too strange, too weak, too anything except accurately understood. And so, a great deal of suffering lives not only in the symptoms, but in the long delay before anyone calls them by their proper names. Healing, when it comes, does not usually arrive in a grand cinematic moment. It is not one breakthrough, one perfect medication, one eloquent therapy session, one morning of waking refreshed and deciding to become a different person forever. It is usually more repetitive than that, and far less elegant. It may begin with sleep becoming slightly less broken, with one panic attack endured without fleeing, with a meal eaten despite the voice of the eating disorder objecting, with one honest sentence spoken in therapy after months of speaking around the real thing, with a medication adjustment that does not feel dramatic but makes getting out of bed 10% less difficult, with an autistic person being allowed not to force eye contact for the comfort of others, with someone with ADHD finally using structures that fit their brain instead of trying to imitate a system that has failed them for 20 years, with a trauma survivor learning that they can sit in a quiet room without scanning every corner, with a person who hears voices beginning to name them as experiences rather than commands. These are small things from the outside. From the inside, they can be enormous. Part of the challenge is that healing rarely looks pure. People improve, then backslide. They learn a skill and then forget to use it when tired. They have insight and then act against it. They do better for 3 months, and then life becomes difficult, and old patterns begin making very confident suggestions again. They start medication, dislike the side effects, stop, worsen, start again, lose faith, regain some, change therapists, avoid sessions, come back, apologize, regress, continue. None of this means treatment is fake. It means minds are living systems, not machines repaired with one correctly sized tool. When a person has suffered for years through fear, shame, dysregulation, or distorted thinking, the pathways of that suffering are practiced. The illness has routines. The person has routines around the illness. Their relationships may have adapted around it. Their work may have adapted around it. Their sense of self may have adapted around it. Recovery therefore asks not only for symptom reduction, but for relearning. That relearning can feel oddly threatening. Even when a symptom is painful, it is often familiar. The anxious person knows how to worry. The depressed person knows how to withdraw. The obsessive mind knows how to ritualize. The traumatized body knows how to brace. The person with unstable relationships knows how to anticipate rejection and protect themselves before they are abandoned. The eating disorder knows how to promise control. The manic mind knows how to romanticize its own speed. Illness can become a system of survival, even while it is causing harm. This is one reason people sometimes resist help they consciously want. They are not being difficult for sport. Part of them is being asked to give up a pattern that has become both prison and protection. To be understood in that moment is powerful. A clinician, a friend, a partner, a parent, a teacher, anyone really, who can recognize that the resistance is not proof that the person wants to stay unwell, but evidence that illness can become woven into safety, is already helping. The right kind of understanding does not flatter the disorder, but it does notice the fear beneath it. It does not say, do whatever the illness demands. It says, I can see why this has felt necessary, and I can also see that it is hurting you. Both things can be true. In fact, with many mental disorders, both things are true most of the time. The hope of being understood is not only about treatment rooms, it belongs in everyday life too. In schools where children are not punished for every sign of neurodivergence before anyone investigates what support they need, in families where symptoms are not immediately translated into character attacks, in friendships where silence is met not only with offense but with curiosity, in workplaces where mental health is not discussed only when someone has become visibly unwell enough to disrupt productivity in an administratively inconvenient way, in public life where schizophrenia is not treated as a horror trope, borderline personality disorder not treated as a warning label, and depression not treated as either a fashionable mood or a moral collapse. So much damage comes from crude interpretations. The mind is complex enough without having strangers flatten it into slogans. There is also a quieter kind of understanding that has to happen inside the person. Not indulgence, not endless explanation without responsibility, but a more accurate relationship with the self. Many people are far harsher with themselves than they would ever be with someone else suffering the same symptoms. They call themselves ridiculous for panicking, pathetic for being depressed, disgusting for binging, useless for forgetting, dramatic for needing reassurance, manipulative for having intense emotions, weak for still reacting to trauma, frightening for having strange thoughts, lazy for struggling to start tasks, and broken for not being able to regulate what others seem to handle with ease. This internal language is rarely helpful. It does not build discipline so much as despair. The mind under strain does not become wiser because it has been insulted more efficiently. Self-understanding, when it grows, often sounds different. It says, this symptom makes sense in the context of what I have lived through, how my brain works, or what this illness does. It says, I am responsible for what I do, but I do not need to describe myself with contempt in order to improve. It says I can set limits without hatred. I can accept help without becoming helpless. I can admit impairment without surrendering identity. I can have a diagnosis without becoming only a diagnosis. Those are not flashy realizations. They are stabilizing ones. They allow a person to relate to their own mind with more steadiness and less panic. Of course, not everyone receives understanding when they need it. Some people meet disbelief. Some meet fear. Some are treated well only when they hide the ugliest parts of their symptoms. Some are supported in theory and dismissed in practice. Some wait years for assessment, years for treatment, years for language that fits, years for someone competent enough to tell the difference between laziness and executive dysfunction, between moodiness and bipolar disorder, between fussiness and an eating disorder, between personality and trauma, between being difficult and being in pain. Many people get better later than they should have had to, simply because no one recognized what was happening soon enough. That is sobering. It is also a reason to take this subject seriously. Good understanding does not merely satisfy curiosity, it changes outcomes. There is a temptation, when talking about healing, to promise too much, to suggest that every person can arrive at perfect peace, complete insight, permanent stability, and a life wholly untouched by recurrence. That is not how most lives work. Some disorders remit and return. Some remain chronic but manageable. Some improve greatly with treatment but still require maintenance. Some leave scars, practical losses, or grief over years affected by illness. Some people learn to live well with symptoms that never disappear entirely. Healing, then, may not mean becoming untouched by the thing. It may mean becoming less ruled by it, less frightened of it, less ashamed by it, better supported in relation to it, more free to build a life that is not organized entirely around avoiding, obeying, or hiding symptoms. That kind of healing is not small. A person who still has anxious thoughts but no longer structures their world around avoidance is healing. A person who still hears critical internal messages from depression but can identify them as illness rather than truth is healing. A person with bipolar disorder who learns their early warning signs and protects sleep like something precious is healing. A trauma survivor who can feel their body tense and still remain in the present is healing. A person with OCD who can allow uncertainty without ritualizing every fear is healing. A person with schizophrenia who stays connected to treatment and builds a steady life despite past episodes is healing. An autistic adult who stops spending every hour trying to appear normal and instead begins living in a way that suits their actual nervous system is healing. A person with an eating disorder who feeds themselves before they feel deserving of food is healing. A person with a personality disorder who pauses before acting on a surge of abandonment terror and chooses not to destroy a relationship in order to test it is healing. Healing often looks like reduced drama and increased ordinary life. Bills paid, sleep improved, meals eaten, messages answered, boundaries held, appointments kept, crises shortened, self-hatred interrupted, routines built, relapses recovered from more quickly, safer choices made more often. The world celebrates dramatic transformations because they are easier to tell stories about. Real recovery often happens in duller clothing. It is deeply meaningful and not always very glamorous. There is comfort in remembering that suffering is not proof of failure. Human minds are vulnerable. They can be affected by genes, hormones, sleep deprivation, grief, abuse, overstimulation, drugs, isolation, poverty, injury, inflammation, chronic stress, developmental differences, and the accumulated force of ordinary living under conditions no nervous system was really designed to handle flawlessly. This is not an excuse for harm, but it is a refusal of unnecessary cruelty. The mind can be injured, overburdened, miscalibrated, sensitized, exhausted, and reshaped by experience. That is not weakness. It is part of being a living system, and yet the same is true in the other direction. Minds can also adapt, recover, rewire, settle, learn, and become more flexible. Not always fully, not always quickly, not always without help, but often more than despair initially allows. Hope is not the naive belief that nothing is wrong. Hope is the quieter belief that wrongness is not the whole story, that symptoms can be mapped, that pain can become more speakable, that support can matter, that a person can be more than the hardest thing their mind has done to them. That explanation can replace at least some shame, that being understood may not cure, but can make living possible in a new way. Perhaps that is the gentlest thought to end with. Not that every mind can be made simple, but that every mind deserves understanding before judgment. Not that suffering is noble, but that it is human. Not that healing is guaranteed to look clean, but that it is often already beginning in forms too small to impress anyone except the person who had to fight for them. A quieter night, a less cruel thought, a meal finished, a ritual resisted, a memory survived, a medication taken, a text answered, a truth spoken aloud for the first time. These are not tiny things inside a life. They are the pieces by which a different life slowly becomes imaginable, and when that happens even a little, the mind is no longer hurting in total isolation. It is being met, carefully, imperfectly, patiently. And that, more often than people realize, is where change begins.